and I hadn't realised it, but Nietzsche's perspectivism is very similar to monadism. Now, Dynamism, this is interesting, Dynamism and modernism were both perspectives largely influenced by Leibniz. And they're very mysterious world conceptions, like rationalism. Eventually I nailed it. That was fairly easy. Phenomenalism, realism, I started to nail it. But dynamism and monadism, which are both Leibniz, very hard. But Nietzsche, I think, in a sense, followed in the steps of Schopenhauer in that he was an atheist, but an anti-materialist. I've had that feeling Nietzsche was a person who couldn't stand the idea, the 19th century idea, that the cosmos was just some vast clockwork machine, or a bit like a billiard ball table where everything was just bouncing around. I was listening to a Essential Salts commentary on Nietzsche, and he was saying, well, his eternal return was actually a bit of a stab at that mechanistic world vision, because Nietzsche was claiming, if that's true, if that's all it is, very likely all those little atoms would one day bounce around and reproduce everything. For example, you know, they used to have that idea that what was it? The creation of the universe. Some felt that the universe would contract into the small point again, and then explode outwards and literally repeat, because everything's just purely matter. It would just repeat what had happened before without any chaos. Of course, chaos is something which is ignored in modern science. I mean, the Greeks believed in it. Modern science, or 19th century science, had ruled out actual chaos.
Right. Right. It's part of how you know we're in the late stage of modernity, is science is starting to explore chaos, which they didn't want to admit existed at all up until, I don't know, late 20th century. But
so this idea of the eternal return was the universe would simply keep on recreating itself. So we'd come back and have all these meetings again.
That's right. Well, and Nietzsche's studies of the ancient Greek conceptions of free will and determinism were enough to put him off simple, the simple determinist fatalist concept of a mechanist universe, because once he grappled with this idea that it's neither as simple as determinism nor as simple as free will, once he got this idea that these two different forces are harnessed together into a dynamic system, that's when the lights came on for him, and he became, like you say, a really atypical atheist, just not like a run-of-the-mill modern atheist in any way.
Yeah, I noticed Kenneth Smith claiming in a dynamic system, you're either expanding or contracting, so to speak. Although I'd be inclined to say that there is a type of neutral state, which is rather fleeting. That nice little neutral state I knew as a kid, just after World War II and before World War III, when things seem relatively pleasant. But it's amazing, of course, how quickly a culture will change. Like the British, we always envision the British as these sort of peacocks running around with their stiff upper lip. But that was the British Empire in its late phase, when it was just about to collapse.
Mm-hmm.
If you were to go back to the people that built the British Empire, say Nelson or something like that, they weren't at all this image we have of the British. This was something somehow they had transformed into a sort of persona that suit an empire that existed. Not the stuff that built an empire.
Right, right.
And it was so rapid, it was only a few generations. that they change. I have to look back at ancient history now that, for example, the Romans, between the Second and Third Punic Wars, went through such a complete change in morals.
Mm-hmm.
The Romans that won the Second Punic War, by our standards, anybody's standards, were the good stuff. They were the highly moral, the self-sacrificial. The lot that ran merely 50 years later, once the Romans got their hands on all that wealth and all that power, very different story. And I use that for my picture of America. I thought America went from this seemingly virtuous culture. And the question is, how quickly can it get into something which you'd hardly call virtuous?
This is where, the book The Tipping Point it's one of the many products of the cybernetics movement that started in the mid 20th century, trying to understand chaos and complex systems. And they were frustrated by their attempts to model the cosmos strictly in Newtonian mechanistic terms, in which every cause can be individually added up to create the whole. They were running into these systems so complex that they could spend the rest of their lives just trying to catalog all the individual causes, let alone trying to work out how they combine. So they had to get new models to try to understand these complex systems. And the tipping point comes out of that, which is one of these things that says, change happens at different paces. And it also manifests in different ways. So one of the ways that change manifests is by not changing. This is something Heraclitus talks about. He says people do not understand, that a system gets to be at rest by changing. It's like for your blood sugar to be stable, your glucagon and insulin both have to be going at it. There's this whole internal strife going on that's invisible to us. And it looks like stasis, but the stasis is just a product. It's not what's actually happening under the surface. And granted, from the Greek concept of teleology, it's the reason why those systems exist is in order to create that apparent stasis, that health zone within which we can survive. So it's Hegel's line is that's the same in history. He takes Heraclitus's ideas and extends them more broadly and says, there are periods that look static, that look stable, but sometimes what's happening is forces under the hood are moving, and you're not going to see what they're doing until they add up to the critical threshold and tip it over. And now all of a sudden the system appears to change very rapidly, when in fact it was changing the whole time. It just wasn't. The numbers were very large, but not large enough to create the necessary threshold. So this is why this stuff is so complex. It reiterates this Greek concern with the finite and the infinite. Part of the struggle for us is that we're finite beings trying to understand an effectively infinite cosmos, and we never know enough to fully interpret what we're looking at. Nietzsche got into this, and that's why he was so dissatisfied with sort of the trivial reductionistic approaches to atheism and materialism that he was seeing around him.
Noticed Kenneth took a stab at the humanists, which always pleases me, actually. But of course, he was making that point. They suffer from a delusion that somehow human beings are the biggest and best things in the universe. Mm-hmm. And, well, you have to think, well, really? Okay, maybe on the planet, we're not too sure about that, but yeah, maybe on the planet Earth. You're saying out there in the universe, if you believe that there are other life forms, that there aren't things out there which make us look like single-celled life forms or something.
Right.
But we are the particular bacteria who can understand the entire universe.
Rick, what you describe about this sort of invisible chaos that sustains things sounds a lot like the quantum flux or the yin-yang symbol. I mean, it just seems interesting, like from both end of history, seems
Yeah.
like there's a indication of that relationship. And maybe that is the relationship between the finite and the infinite. Like there is that divided line, as Plato would say. But Plato's divided line was not the yin-yang symbol or the
Right.
quantum flux. But maybe part of it, but it is not the other side of it. So
this is where the story Flatland I find really helpful. We're here if we're living on if we're only getting a limited sample of the cosmos because we're only perceiving some of the dimensions of what's going on. We don't have to be talking about the dimensions of, length, breadth, and depth. We could be talking about, any dimensions of a problem. So if we only have a subset of them, it's like we're little flatland creatures living on a plane. And for 100 years, a sphere can be moving towards the plane and we don't see it because we have no up. There is no up. That sphere doesn't exist, and neither is anything above or below us. There's only the flatland. And to us, it appears as though the change begins when the sphere passes through our plane. And we don't know that that's what's happening, but all of a sudden a circle opens up from nowhere and then shrinks back to nothing. And we think that's the event, and that it began when the dot first appeared and began to grow, and that it ended when the dot, shrank back down to a dot and vanished. We say that was the event. And what we fail to understand is the event is this sphere's been moving for 100 years, and it's going to keep moving after it passes through us. We just got this little snapshot of it, and we attempt to model the whole cosmos as though it's bound by our limited flatland understanding.
Well, that creates a problem, though. I mean, since we live at the present time in a small area, all of us, including Nietzsche and everybody else, is caught in this flatland. And when you're in the flatland, all you could do is speculate that something else might be going on, underground. And so, in some sense, nobody's got it right, including the people who suspect that the flat is wrong.
Right. Yeah, this is why a lot of philosophers of science say the most important part of science is learning to ask the questions. That's the best part, because you may not have all the answers, but you're right. There's a question that should be addressed. It's like, what dimensions of this problem are we not even aware of? Where else should we be looking? I mean, I often think the most revolutionary parts of science don't come from specific theories. Those are like the fruits of science. And the most revolutionary parts of science come from the technological inventions that allow us to see the world in a new way. The microscope, the telescope. Those are two examples. The particle collider. These things are opening up whole dimensions of life that previously we just weren't aware of. One of the things where I think our literature on science does us a disservice is the way it constantly tries to focus on the present understanding as the right one, and doesn't focus enough on the history of science and how did we come and when did we come to understand things. My favorite on this topic is astronomy in the 20th century. If you go from 1900 to 2000 and say, what did we know in 2000 that we didn't know in 1900? The answer is far more exciting than a moon landing. I mean, we didn't know stars were mostly made of hydrogen in 1900. That's a pretty basic thing not to know. We didn't know that hydrogen was the most abundant element in the universe. When you consider that at this point, we know that almost everything is hydrogen and the rest is like a little seasoning on top, it's sort of astonishing that we didn't know that it was the most abundant, let alone that it's almost all hydrogen. We didn't know that the universe had multiple galaxies. We thought this was it, and we only barely had a concept of this galaxy, since we thought this galaxy was everything. The idea that, oh no, there's so many galaxies, you couldn't count them. We didn't know that,
Actually, that was Kant's theory. He believed that there were other galaxies.
Yeah, people speculated about it.
Yeah, it wasn't broadly accepted until something like Hubble. The Hubble telescope showed up. Oh, Hooker? Was it the Hooker telescope? I'm getting mixed up now. Hubble was the guy working on it. That's right.
That's right. That's right.
Well, I mean, but this raised a kind of problem because, I mean, by your last statement, it seems to be singing the hymns of technology, and technology does give us certain things, right?
Particular kind of technology. Particular
certain thing, but the technology also gave us the atomic bomb and all sorts of things. So I mean, like, so even when we try to ask questions, we end up giving different answers that we might expect.
Yes. Yeah, this is, we're gonna turn to the actual text now, but as part of that, what you just said is like the core thing I'm going to be talking about today. That Hegel sees, and it's in the text I quoted there. It's not where we're going to start. We're going to get there in a moment. But Hegel sees the development of the human mind as having a teleological direction, that the mind, the infantile mind, wants to develop into the mature form. It has a drive to develop, just like the embryo, the fertilized egg has a drive to develop into an embryo and into a person. All of these stages of development, they don't just happen to happen like a clockwork. That everything about the structure and sort of the information contained implicitly within things drives them towards their own development. And what's uncomfortable about this is that to get to the good stuff, you have to go through the bad stuff. There is this way in which the worst excesses of Banauseia, which we've talked about before, the overly intellectual, rational mind that's disconnected from reality and thinks it's fine to just drop people into categories and decide to eliminate some of them and things like all of this kind of abstract systematic thinking. You can't develop the adult mind, the actual heuristic mind, without first developing the Banausic mind. And you have to get good at the Banausic mind to get through to the heuristic mind, because the heuristic mind has to harness the basically both gnosis and noesis together. And if one of them is not adequately developed, it's like trying to string a bow with either a rotten string or rotten wood. It's not going to work. They both have to be strong. But as Hegel says, they can only be developed sequentially. And so you end up passing through these two half-witted stages of development. First, the overly, live wire, subjective, experiential mind that we're born into. And then out of that, the overly abstracted, generalizing, systematizing mind that some of us develop out of that. And neither of these is a good place to stop. It's like stopping with the nuclear bomb and not going on to develop the ability to see the cosmos and understand your place in it. It's dangerous if you have sort of the earlier egotistical drives, but now you're armed with nukes. It's a terrible combination. So we're going to come back to this theme over and over this week and in the weeks ahead of what you just said, Phil. I think you set me up nicely for today's discussion. No. Before I call on hands, which I'll do in a sec, I want to introduce everybody to Ella. If you came after she joined, this is Ella's first time. What we're going to do as part of today is go back and bring her up to date a little bit with where we are. Not try to recapitulate everything, but just enough to follow today's discussion. And for Ella's benefit, what we've done so far is sort of a freewheeling discussion that's not particularly related to the text. It's just sort of inspired by past discussions. But for the rest of today, we're gonna go to the text, and I shared some of it in the chat there. Donald, go ahead, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
This last week I was reading a defense of the liberal arts. And one of the defenses was that studying philosophy is useful because it helps us become better people, which a great deal of irony in that. It's purely a Banausic view of philosophy to see it as useful, even if it's, which, you haven't quite escaped the trap you're trying to escape. You're just reinforcing it. And I wonder, there are those. Yeah, I think even Kenneth would say philosophy's pretty much useless. It has to be by its nature. If we found it useful, it would only be a sign of how we're not making much progress philosophically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, what does Nietzsche say, right? Philosophy is only for the healthy, the sick it ever makes sicker. You know, the moment we banalify philosophy and try to turn it into a tool, we miss out on everything it can do for us. So philosophy is something that weirdly is essential, but useless from a use value perspective. It's like growing up. You know, you get to a certain age as a kid and you think all these adults are idiots and you're like, I don't want to grow up. Why should I do that? And you don't know how to explain to them. Growing up may be useless and it may be frustrating, but it's also essential. You know, that's where the mature mind is, and you don't even, and the mature body, and you don't even know what you're capable of until you become one. But granted, from your own frame of reference that you have right now as a child, it seems like a terrible idea. And this is why you see, like, the Romans, you know, punishing people for indulging in useless philosophizing. It's why you see people like Seneca opening their books by apologizing for wasting anybody's time by daring to talk about philosophy and rushing to assure people, it's okay, I'm going to show you how it's useful. I'm going to show you how it's useful. And I think, as David has pointed out before, Kenneth calls that a form of barbarism, the belief that only useful things should exist, because it's like the belief that people should learn how to make atomic bombs, but not learn whether it's a good idea to use atomic bombs. You know, it's like the usefulness is not the issue. There's a broader question that goes beyond usefulness that can't be expressed within the terms of usefulness, but that's, you know, that's vital. So I'm glad you brought that up, Donald. Thank you. Ella, then Stephen, then Phil. Go ahead, Ella. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to respond to a couple of the things that a number of people have brought up. Heraclitus, you never step into the same river twice. And then going into Whitehead and process philosophy. You know, I when I think about that whole, you know, movement, physicality and movement in Whitehead's physicalism, there seems to be a lot of truth to that, as you mentioned, that there's so many things we can't intuit because our senses are limited, our cognition is limited. But yeah, David Bohm, you know, tried with his metaphor, the implicate order is there underneath everything, and then it's unfolding into the explicate order, which we can see. And I agree with the sentiment that, you know, we can't, even the greatest philosophers cannot seem to understand, and the greatest scientists, and you know, it's important to try to pull all of that together for me as much as I can. And yeah, just the last comment, just a little bit different. Hegel, I think he was he was more into the monad concept, I think. And I think with the monad concept, everything goes back to the one, like the point. And that somebody brought that up, I believe. So I do like the expansion from Kant to Hegel, because I just feel it's nearer to the truth, given what Hegel knew at that time. And you expounded upon the fact that how much do we know since Hegel's time, you know? So yeah, those are my thoughts. Thanks.
Thanks, Ella. So for your benefit, I appreciate what you said. For your benefit, a little background on this book. Millennia and Microcosm is a book that David and I are putting together from the columns that Kenneth Smith wrote in the years 98, 99, and 2000 in the back of a magazine called the Comics Journal, which was dedicated to trying to bring serious journalistic and critical approaches to evaluating the art form of comic books. And because the publisher was a friend and previous student of Kenneth Smith's, they made an arrangement where Kenneth Smith was allowed to write his straight philosophy stuff in the back of this journal that was ostensibly about comic books, you know, and the Comics Journal. So it appeared there as end times, talking about, you know, the turn of the millennium and what was coming and things we ought to think about. But more specifically, what he was doing with this column, and which the new title of the title he prefers for the book, Millennia and Microcosm, sort of better underscores, is the idea that we're living in an epoch of history that has its own interpretation of the world and ourselves and our place in it, what Hegel might call the zeitgeist. And that as moderns, we're willing to allow that people living in previous epochs didn't see the world clearly, that they were all primitive and deluded and they didn't have science and objectivity like we do. But we're not willing to admit that we are also an epoch of history. We have our own zeitgeist, and there's parts of reality we don't see clearly either. We kind of don't like that idea. We want to believe that we're the smartest and the most educated and the most scientific people that ever lived. So the purpose of this book is to try to reveal to us some of the things that moderns can't see about themselves in the world. And the way, and the goal of doing that is to help free us from modernist ideology so that we have a better chance of understanding those things that otherwise our natural, or let's say our cultivated modern interpretation of the world would prevent us from seeing. In order to get us ready for that, he walks us through the previous two epochs of European history. He takes us, chapter 4 is entirely about ancient civilization. And he can do it in one chapter because he taught it so many times in college. He's just got it down. So it's divided. Chapter 4 is divided into a series of lettered sections to talk about each of the different aspects of how the ancients saw the world. And we're in section F, mythos and logos. We've worked our way through the first 5, and we're halfway through the 6th. And each of them builds up part of how the ancients saw the world differently than the way we do. And what we learn, I think the participants who've been with us so far would agree, is that each of those 5 previous concepts from the ancient world really is alien. I mean, really different than the way we see the world. I mean, a very different approach. So we're working on the 6th one now, mythos and logos. And then after that, the rest of the book is divided in 2 between a large section that's about the medieval worldview and how they saw things that's different from the ancient and different from the modern. And then it culminates in a series of chapters about the modern worldview. That is to say, once we've learned how to put on and take off the ancient and medieval worldviews, we can then put them on and turn and look at the modern world and say, what would an ancient say about the modern world? Of course, moderns imagine that what they'd say is, gee whiz, you guys are like gods. This is so cool. I wish I was you. But he says that's absolutely not what they would do. they would look at us and say, you are strange people. You look at the world in strange ways. I don't know why yes, you see some things that we didn't see, but look at all these things that we did see that you can't see. How is it that it's become invisible when it used to be visible? Now, they would struggle to understand why we have the gaps in our understanding that we do, as well as being impressed by the insights that we have. And that's his goal, is to get to where we can not be captives of the modern worldview, but we can put on different worldviews, try them, depending on which is most useful to the problem at hand. So that's where we are overall in this, and that'll become clearer as today goes along, as we focus more on the text. So I hope that's a helpful intro.
Yes, very helpful. And thank you so much, Rick.
My pleasure, Ella. Stephen, go ahead. What's on your mind?
I'd probably say, well, yeah, philosophy is very useful. I'd go opposite. I would say I have a friend who, taught in Russia, and she was saying to get a doctorate in Russia, you have to do a unit of philosophy. They're still very old world compared to us moderns in the West. And what I'm learning, I think actually, at least in higher education, you would want a unit of philosophy, even if it was just studying the Republic. because what you learn from, and it is a bit like banging your head against a brick wall much of the time, what you learn is how limited your understandings are. Now, most people object to that. I don't want to study philosophy. I want stuff that produces quick results. But the lesson of philosophy is, well, do you really understand anything? Are you so cocksure you understand everything? Yeah. Guy goes, oh, I'm cocksure if I get this brick and throw it through a window, there's a result. A quick result that pleases me. But in philosophy, I don't get that. It's a hard struggle. It's the same with history. I was one of the few in high school class that liked history. 2 out of 30 people, the other 28 hated the subject. But you can avoid embarrassments. I mean, look what happened in the Canadian Parliament recently, where the whole kit and caboodle of them, the Speaker of the House introduced this Ukrainian friend who was almost 100 years old, who had fought against the Russians in World War II. Trudeau and a whole lot were clapping like seals, you know, without realising the guy had been a member of the SS. And they had no idea, you know, if you had a monicum of history, you'd think, hang on, hey, before we start cheering, maybe we should, you know, check this out a bit. No, let's push the button straight away. And this is where we are now, because everyone thinks they're so smart with all their machines and all their technology. And they think they've lost something. They've lost understandings that people had 100 years ago who were a lot more careful about what they did. We've so fallen in love with the button on the wall, the quick and easy results,
right,
that we don't understand the difficulties of reality anymore. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, it's like Kenneth says, every other subject gives you something new to think about. Only philosophy gives you something new to think with. And, you know, something new to think with is the difference between subjects that teach you how to get what you want versus subjects that teach you how to question what you want and whether it's really what you need. You know, it's just because you can do something doesn't mean necessarily you should. And answering those kinds of questions, you know, requires context that philosophy can give, or history, like you say. You know, the I also read that article with a certain amount of schadenfreude about everybody cheering on the guy without having figured out who he was first. That's pretty typical of the modern era, and you might say that's typical of the whole problem of philosophy. You know, that's what it's meant to address, is the whole, okay, yes, Oedipus, you could kill that annoying guy at the river and defeat the Sphinx and become king and marry the queen, but you might be sorry you got what you want. It might be the worst possible thing that could happen to you. Maybe a little more context would help here. I was literally just writing about this morning, so I'm with you. I think you're right. There is a usefulness. I think the way Kenneth, if pressed, would put it to resolve your and Donald's take. There is a usefulness to philosophy that's difficult for people obsessed with usefulness to understand until it's too late. And then it becomes all too clear what that usefulness would have been if they only would not have done the thing that they did. So yeah. All right, Phil, and then Sharon. Go ahead, Phil. What's on your mind?
Yeah, you know, once again, I'm going to chime in this word useful. And I'm thinking that not only is that ambiguous, it might be contrary to itself. In other words, a little bit like the yin yang. I mean, the useless becomes the useful in a deep way. Because if philosophy is about wisdom, that it transcends just pure knowledge. And that's what philosophy is about. And so, you know, like, one of the things is that you remember, one needs to know thyself and understand yourself. And that's a useful thing, to understand yourself. And I'm thinking back to Plato and Socrates. Plato has this view, and I kind of like the view, but on the other hand, I sort of wonder about the view. The forms are, in some sense, an aspiration to reach the mind of God, infinite knowledge in some sense, in some reach, except he has it backwards, like you already with the mind of God. Is a matter of clarifying all of that until you understand it. And I think it might be the other way around. That's why I kind of raised the question before, whether Plato didn't do violence to Socrates, because Socrates was told by the Delphi, the oracle, that he is the wisest man on the earth, maybe has ever lived. And he knew that he was ignorant. And so he wondered, why did the oracle tell me I was the wisest when I know nothing? And because the wisdom begins with the fact of knowing that you know nothing, that you're limited. And I think the way I'm looking at the divided line now is the aspiration to reach the mind of God. Or, in terms of an idea, maybe there is no God, but nonetheless, we need the idea of God to do that. And the realization that you will never get there because God is infinite, or this abstract God is infinite, and you're finite. And so the true wisdom is piety, and humility, to know that you will never be God, but doesn't prevent you wanting to reach in that direction. To me, that's wisdom, creating the balance between wanting to know and knowing that you will never know the complete, but you are moving forward. And I think if there's anything that, in a sense, the humanity, the deep lesson of humanity is not to teach you so much about your accumulation of knowledge. It is that, but to have the piety and the humility to know you're not there yet. And maybe you will never be there. And I think that's one of the lessons that modernity have not learned, because we've thrown out piety. We think that's a really bad word, right? And piety is something that allows you to say, well, I'm trying, but I'm not there, but I'm working hard at it, and that's a good thing. And know that, to know that instead of walking out the Garden of Eden and giving the old man the finger, now that we know everything, screw you, we'll go live and eat of Eden, and everything will be fine. and God is saying, okay, we'll see. I think that lesson is sort of shown in the Bible. Even though that's a myth, it's a Bible. And nonetheless, it teaches us that maybe Adam and Eve should have been a little bit more pious. We learned these things now. What else do we need to learn? I think that is a lesson that we all should learn, because we are all, to some degree, rather proud of ourselves when we do something, that's impressive. And maybe we should have that, but we also need to have the reverse side to understand that maybe we shouldn't be so proud, and understand that this is still just a small step. I hate to bring in Neil Armstrong, and I'm not using him to sing as him. A small step for mankind, for man and a great leap for humanity. Okay, that's overstating it. Maybe we should understand that we're trying to do the great leap for humanity, but we're only making the small step. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Sharon, what's on your mind? Gotta come off mute.
Well, I just wanted to say, as the most infantile philosopher at this table, I think, well, why? Was that bad, Rick? But that's how I see myself. I think I see the utility, the usefulness of philosophy as an ongoing process, and it's evolutionary. And David put up something from Kenneth Smith here. It says it's about opening new dimensions for insight, learning to think about what one is doing when one thinks. And in the 60 or 70 weeks that I've sat with you, I've done a lot of back reading into the philosophers. And each philosopher, as he goes through his time period, he adds new insight. He adds new insight to the culture and its evolution. And as we do mythos over this weekend, I was thinking, when does the culture hit the transition point where it goes from mythos to logos, and then logos from logos to reasoning, to rationalism, if that's the order, right? But that's what I was getting from it. And I think the philosophical insights of all the individuals contributes to this. And I think that is tremendously useful. And it will never end because we're still alive and we continue to evolve as we live. So that's the usefulness of philosophy. I don't know if that's too basic, but it's digestible.
It's just a quick comment in terms of your thing. If we cannot have this infinite mind, okay, think of it as a vertical thing, then I think what you said is very important. I'm thinking that when you learn for other people, other dimension, that is actually cosmopolitanism, is you do not increase the, how say it, the vertical dimension, but you increase the breadth of understanding, which is another dimension, because what the breadth of understanding does is that it deepens your horizon, it expands your horizon. So the horizon is not to infinity, but to widen the horizon. And that's also important to know. Thank you.
And the second thing, I wanted to pick up on something that you said we've forgotten about piety. I think as I look through time, I see that the principles change. Some of them are forgotten, but the ones that are enduring, which are the ones that give us value and meaning, they come back again. And so we probably will not have piety in this generation because I think we've thrown it out, but the next generation might adapt it because it adds value to their life. So this is part of the transition process, which is continuously evolving. That's the way I see it. So please correct me if I'm not on point.
Thank you, Sharon. Yeah, and you know, for Ella's benefit, Sharon asks these questions and they're great. And you know, the entire arc that you've jumped into the middle of here that's been going on for a month or so, and will probably go on for a couple more weeks, is an attempt to answer some of Sharon's questions about kind of, you know, what on earth is Kenneth talking about with mythos here? Because he's using it in weird ways. The term myth and mythos, he's not using them in the way that we're used to as moderns. He's using them in the ancient sense, and the ancient sense is almost the opposite of our sense. So to a modern, a myth is a falsehood. It might be a popular story, it might be a primitive attempt to explain things, but in general, it's a falsehood, even if it's widely believed and popular. Whereas that's not how the ancients saw things. So to us, we see myth as a primitive stage of development that you need to leave and get out of in order to get to, well, of course, a modern thinks that nothing could be better than a modern. So we think the point is to evolve out of a mythos culture and into a modern culture. So it's natural for us when we see Kenneth Smith talking about the way that the ancient Greeks they started writing while they're in the middle of a transition from a mythos culture to a logos culture. So our read of that is, since the logos culture comes second, and since it resembles us more than the mythos culture does, we sort of figure, well, then logos culture must be more advanced than mythos culture, just like we think we're more advanced than the Greeks. So it must be better to have a logos culture than a mythos culture. That's our natural interpretation. But that's not the way Kenneth means it. And it's not the way the Greeks meant it, because it's not what they meant by myth. What they meant by myth is actually really hard to say in modern terms. In modern terms, it's inconceivable to us that we could be the primitives. It's inconceivable to us that reason and rationality aren't sufficient. We think that should be enough. That's the pinnacle of human achievement mentally. Nothing could be better than that. But the argument of Heraclitus and Aristotle and Hegel and others, including Kenneth Smith, is that what we call reason is only the second stage of mental development for Homo sapiens, not the final stage, not the adult stage. That we rise out of this first, well, I think I described it last week as the Homo sapiens, just like butterflies go through a metamorphosis and have different life stages. At a cognitive level, Homo sapiens goes through 3 births. There is the mysterious stage before physical birth. We don't know, and maybe we'll never know, what it's like to be an embryo, what it's like to be developing your nervous system. How do you experience the world? How do you experience yourself? We may never know. But the second stage of development after you're born is this dualic stage, this naive form of gnosis, which is very experiential, very, very tapped into what it's feeling. You know, a kid stubs his toe and begins crying because that's his whole world, is the pain in his toe. I mean, he hasn't been around very long. This is an enormous amount of his experience. It's what he's feeling in his toe right now. So there is a way in which he is more attentive to his immediate feelings and experiences than we are. And as we grow, we distance ourselves from that. We gain perspective, and perspective comes with distance. And for some people, it still stays an experiential life predominantly, but other people grow so dissatisfied with the experiences of their life that they fission off and begin to seriously develop this second cognitive stage. They go through a crisis and sort of are reborn as intellectuals, and this would be the third stage of development. This is more like logos culture, and this is where you think everything has an explanation that's logical and mathematical and systematic. Laws are important, organizational schemas are important, categories are important. You know, all of these things, these become the preoccupations of life, and you become you begin to insist that experiences have an obligation to fit within our tidy intellectual categories. And anything that doesn't sort of ends up getting suppressed as not existing, not being real, not important, not noticeable, negligible. And this, at its pinnacle, is what Kenneth Smith's talking about when he talks about logos culture. This is what the Greeks were transitioning into. You see far more focus on logic and systematic thinking as you move from Heraclitus through Socrates and Plato to Aristotle, and especially as you move into the sophists, and you see the way that they're teaching you how to win a debate, regardless of whether you're right or wrong. Right? Their even values themselves and virtues are being turned into negligible considerations. In the thing that's important is how to get what you want, how to win at a practical level becomes the obsession during logos culture. As they shed more and more of their traditional values that they inherited from their distant, unexamined past, which used to keep them healthy and whole just through the processes of cultural evolution. They're now suppressing all that stuff and saying what's important is to win. And to win, you have to be systematic. And you have to not say what you actually feel, you have to say what you think will win the argument. And so people language changes from a form of authentic, candid expression into a form of manipulation, like a tool. And this is what happens to everything. The more the culture grows into a logos culture, the more things lose their traditional values and get reduced to means. What will this get me? How, will this make me rich? Can I beat the other guy if I say these words? This is the trap of the third stage of development after the second birth. It seems to make sense in and of itself. Now, when we're at that stage, and I went through that stage as a person, and when we're at that stage, the world of the mind for human beings seems to be split between two choices. You can either be emotional and naive and subjective, which is what you grew out of, which is what you were as a child, which you're ashamed of, right? Or you can be objective and rational and intellectual. And that's it. You think those are the only two choices. And it seems to make sense that way, because the rational part of the mind, the way that it processes information, excludes the future, excludes the other possibility that it can't see yet, because it's still reasoning through a flatland. It doesn't know that there's a third dimension. And the third dimension is what Kenneth Smith says the Greeks call mythos culture. Mythos culture is the stage of the adult, mature mind that Homo sapiens is supposed to, through the process of evolution, we are intended to develop into. Just like a cheetah is not supposed to stop at a cub, it's supposed to develop into a full-grown cheetah that could do the amazing things that adult cheetahs can do. Homo sapiens is supposed to develop all the way into the mythic mind. And this definition, this is almost an inexpressible sentence in modern English. The mythic, how can the false mind, the mythic mind, possibly be the greatest accomplishment, of human mental development? It's just, that's obviously not true. So everything that we're saying doesn't make any sense. Kenneth talks a lot about the language problem we have here, that every important term for understanding philosophy has been redefined by moderns so that it circularly seems to reinforce the modern worldview. It's almost impossible to say in a way that actually communicates things that modernity excludes, such as the concept that there's another stage of development that we've been aborting for 500 years that's supposed to develop in us. So when they say the mythic mind, they don't mean the false mind, right? The Greeks, the ancient Greeks, Kenneth Smith, they would say that the rational mind is one false mind, and the naive experiential mind that we start out with is another false mind. And what's false about them is that they both only are capable of seeing in reality half-truths. They can only see half of the picture. The experiential mind can only see what we feel, right? What we hear, what we taste, what we touch, what affects us emotionally, what we remember. These are the things that are important to the experiential mind. And anything that requires more abstraction than that to figure out is sort of a non-thing to the experiential mind. So half of reality, the larger picture of what's going on, is sort of invisible, and only the immediate experience is real. To the intellectual, it's half-witted the other direction. It's completely uprooted itself. It doesn't trust its feelings and experiences. It wants theories. It wants ideas. It wants systems of interpretation. It wants ideologies that tell it how you're supposed to understand the things that you look at. And the intellectual wants to orient himself within social frameworks that have levels and rules for how do you climb? How do I get more money? How do I get more power? How do I get a wife? How do I achieve the things I want to achieve? It all gets, instead of being this rich, scary stew of actual experiences, it gets abstracted out to recipes. All you have to do is the following. Just, accomplish these things for this many years and you'll get a promotion. All of the world gets reduced down to these sort of abstractions and systems. And by the time you're fully inhabiting that mindset, you no longer remember what the point was of that shameful early mind that you grew out of. You don't get that it was better connected to reality than you are now, that you've divorced yourself from it. And so you don't realize that you're missing half of what's going on. The mythic mind, the third stage of development, according to Hegel and Heraclitus and others, is the stage that, again, you have to go through a crisis to get there. It takes another birth, a conceptual crisis. As Aeschylus says in the Agamemnon, Drop by drop, wisdom is distilled from pain, from suffering. You can't just think your way to the adult mind. You have to go through the crisis of screwing up badly because you're an intellectual, and finally being forced to confront that it was your own intellectualism that ran you into those walls and made those terrible things happen. That's when you grow as dissatisfied with intellectualism as you were earlier with naive subjective experientialism. And at that stage, you're ready to be born again, the final time, the third time, in which you realize you threw out the baby with the bathwater. Literally, the baby self, which had the best connection to reality, you checked the baby perspective. And so you learn to put back together the vulnerability to feelings and experiences and use that as a tether to guide your intellectualism, to keep it from running away from reality. They get strung together like the wood and the string of a bow, so that they pull on each other and they correct each other. This is how you create the polyntropy, the dynamic system that Heraclitus talks about. This is the adult mind. I think it was a couple of weeks ago that we said, this is what it means when Odysseus gets home and he defeats the suitors, because he's the only one who can string the bow of Odysseus and knock an arrow and draw it and fire it through the axes to hit the target. That hitting the target is the adult mind in action as a dynamic system. The whole thing is a metaphor for he's the only adult male in the room. The others are all Douloy and Benassoy. He's the only Aristos present. And Penelope, who's a sapiosexual, she's not going to tolerate marrying any of these suitors because none of them is at the level of Odysseus. Only Odysseus will satisfy her because he's the only one who's an Aristos. So this is the framework for mythos and logos. When he says that the Greek culture was passing out of a mythos stage into a logos stage, he's not saying that it was rising higher and coming to resemble us who are more advanced than the Greeks are. He's saying it was a collapse. They were falling from their pinnacle. They had already reached their pinnacle earlier and were in decline. At the very stage when they were most proud of themselves, most sure of themselves, they were developing math and logic to the greatest pinnacle, their literature at the greatest pinnacle. That was the stage at which they'd already passed their peak and didn't know it. And you start to see it in the criticisms of Aristotle against Greek culture. You start to see it in the criticisms of Thucydides against the Athenians, and the ways in which, however persuasive they are, however powerful they are, the things they're doing in the Peloponnesian War are still wrong. And that a few generations ago, they would have known better. He's critiquing them for having fallen, and as it turns out, he was right. Because Greece just kept war after war collapsing in upon itself and destroying everything it had lived for. So this is what he means by mythos versus logos. There is a third category that he's not including here, right? Which is what came before logos culture. I mean, before the developments of the mythos culture that they collapsed from, there would have been some much earlier stage that was more primitive, experiential, directly connected to nature, and so forth. We're with mythos versus logos makes us think we're talking about two choices, and actually there was a third choice there that's not being discussed, but that each of us knows because we were that person when we were very young. We all lived through that first stage of development. Stephen, and then Phil. Go ahead, Stephen.
I was just going to bring up Whitehead's point again about the drift of modern thought. Now, I've heard the claim that he said, we went the wrong way. If we could go back in time and eliminate Kant, maybe we should start over again. And his point is, in terms of realism versus idealism, that the modern world has become horribly idealistic. As you were saying, so obsessed with ideas that they've lost reality as a perspective. It's got lost out there somewhere. You'd have to go out and do a expedition to find reality again. Whitehead felt this was tremendously important, that people start to understand this loss of reality. Should go back and start trying to study what reality is. And I can't say I fully understand it, but I get the inkling there is a problem, a big problem there. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, my main exposure to Whitehead was through his and Russell's work on Principia Mathematica, because of course I was obsessed with math and science during my peak intellectual stage earlier in life. And I've come to realize in the last year I've been doing Whitehead a disservice, that he may have been by far the more sophisticated of the two thinkers. And I can't remember all the things I was reading. Oh, Christopher Alexander, who I've talked about before, the philosopher of architecture. He was heavily influenced by Whitehead. And it was when I was just reading that a couple of weeks ago that I was reminded I really need to go back and find myself some of Whitehead's later philosophical work, where he says the things you're talking about, because I'm at that stage. When I was first reading Kenneth Smith, I was not at the stage where I was ready for this stuff. I think I've mentioned before, I found it tedious how much he criticized the modern world and how much he criticized intellect. I didn't like it. I wanted him to get to the point and give me the answers. I still had a utilitarian mind, around 2000. I wasn't prepared to really understand this stuff. And it was only with time immersed in it, as I found I found various breakthroughs, to the sides one way or another, that I gradually began to get the perspective to come to cherish the culture critic side of what Kenneth Smith does. That his core point being, you're never going to get out of the labyrinth if you don't study the labyrinth. You have to see how it works. You have to understand how the mind encloses itself in these envelopes and cuts itself off from the evidence, which is in front of us all the time, that could tell us that we're pursuing a half-witted approach to life. It's always there. Like literally every word, every sentence we say, everything we look at has evidence, like the finger pointing to the moon saying, look over there, look over there. But the structure of our ideology, like Kierkegaard warns us, makes it so that we can't see the finger as pointing to the thing that we don't have. It somehow seems to be pointing back at us and saying, we're okay, it's fine the way it is, don't ask too many questions. They're there to worry your little head over it. And so, I didn't have an appetite for that kind of culture criticism until he managed to break it open in me. This is also where I was telling somebody the quote from Kafka that Kenneth Smith uses at the front of one of his books, where he says, a book should be an ice axe, to break up the frozen sea within us. And I now love this quote, but at the time when I first read his book and I saw that there, I was like, that's an odd quote. Why should a book be anything? Why can't a book be whatever it wants? Who are you to say what a book should be? I thought it was a weird thing to put up front. Of course, now I feel exactly the opposite. I'm like, yeah, for the love of God, something to break up that envelope and get me out of this trap is exactly what I want. So thank you, Stephen. I'm going to go read some Whitehead. Phil, go ahead. What's on your mind?
Yeah, I'm gonna say the story that you just told, but in a different way. But it's really the relationship between half-witted and muddle-headed. We have both. Okay, and I think trapped within that is that our part of our, I guess, limited intellect, because we're finite, is forgetfulness. We forget many of the things, and part of the reason why forget is that we don't live that long. It's hard to remember my time in Egypt when I was never there. Okay, so that's also part of the problem of forgetfulness. So for that to be, then it has to somehow be embodied in some form to even remember the embodiment of that. I was just a week ago in this sort of thing where three women philosophers were asking a question, and they said, why is it that the feminine mind has a problem of separating itself, and and to do what Descartes and all the great men philosophers are able to do, is to think purely in terms of mind. And my first thought was that, well, first of all, you shouldn't separate the feminine mind and the masculine mind between men and women, because we all have a mixture of both. It's a question of rather degrees. And it seems to me the feminine mind is unable to think as abstractly about just the mind, because it refuses to separate itself from the body. So there is it's not that the Cartesian relationship of mind and body, but the mind and body are interlinked. So therefore, to forget about the body is to be half-witted, let's say, okay? And to say, well, you can purify yourself in some sense. That's true, that might be muddle-headed. So you need the both of them. And I thought back to this, like, how does all this develop? Remember, I said at one point, it was the splitting of the stone. And I thought, well, men, between the hunter-gatherer society, men were always out there hunting, facing danger, And this tip of the spear, this arrowhead, that was very useful in terms of doing that. The feminine mind, which is more about, I guess, women, if you want to put it that way, was more about community and relationship of the tribe, and how people relate to each other, caring for the children, all that, taking care of what the structure of those relationships are. And at some point, the efficiency of hunting, in some sense, was the beginning of this sort of like, this tool is useful, as Donald would say. And it was this usefulness that began to actually develop the instrumental mind. The mind is also a tool for the usefulness of the arrowhead that you could conquer the world. So it's already beginning to be a conquest. And so by the time you develop civilization, the instrumental mind was the dominant thing. It's sort of like, that really was the story of Osiris and Seth, because it was very productive. And so in some sense, it became very, very important moving the culture along, and we're thankful for all that advance. But in the meantime, maybe it has slowly forgotten the interaction between the body and the mind, that there's connection. And when you then go back from civilization back to that point, that's when you realize that men, by and large, saw the body differently than women. The masculine mind, I would put it that way, versus the feminine mind. Because the body itself becomes the extension of the instrumental mind to the body itself as a tool that held the spear that stabbed the bison, right? This tool using is actually almost very familiar, more familiar to the masculine mind than the feminine mind, because the feminine mind is busy taking care of the community and gathering things together. And I think that situation is interesting. And I thought to myself, it's interesting that these women philosophers are beginning to re-ask that questioning like, why is it that we are not able to separate ourselves as efficiently as Descartes? I think, therefore I am. No, because your thinking is not all you are. Your thinking is always attached to your body. And when the feminine mind refuses to let go of existence, being in the world, then in a sense, that creates a bit of tension in the transition to the pure mind as such. But I think that is a good thing. It's kind of interesting that at this moment is the moment of the women liberation, right? We finally realize that maybe there's something more to just I think, therefore I am. I exist, therefore I am as well. As I think, therefore I am. And it's sort of interesting. I never got to ask that question. In fact, if I asked that question, put it that way, they would probably think I'm sexist to think, like, you mean like women can't think? No, that's not what I mean. I mean, thinking is half-witted by itself, and you have to be connected. You have to be grounded in existence in order also to think. So the bidirectionality is important. And I think that's what you mean by creating the Aristoi, right?
The mythic mind. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
So I think it is that forgetfulness that has gotten us into the trouble we are in now, because we have overthink the situation. All right. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, certainly core to this is this is where the German in Hegel is so helpful, when he starts naming the different kinds of thinking. And he gives us these German terms, which is great because we don't have any English terms. In English, we have to resort to saying, well, one of them is thinking and the other one isn't, because that's just how English is structured. English has been modernized to the point that if we try to use the Old English terms, thinking versus kenning, everyone's like, what now? Are you being Scottish? Are you being deliberately, are you trying to pretend to be a knight or something, being deliberately, vague and obsolete? With the modern English doesn't permit us to claim that what we do when we're experiencing the world and our feelings and our memories is thinking. But Hegel, in his, not only in the phenomenology of Geist, but I think more clearly in the philosophy of Geist, in his Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, he just makes the point absolutely clear that there's three different forms of thinking. There's absolutely three different kinds of thinking. There's Begriff, there's Verstand, and there's Vernunft. And it is the overly Verstand people who insist that only that should be called thinking, and the other two are just some sort of primitive subjectivism. And he says, and that's what's wrong with an intellectual. They have contempt for, for 2/3 of the faculties of the mind. And they think only their one faculty is the important one. And so, this idea of even just the existence of a word like Begriff, which means the kind of thought that you're thinking when you're not being an intellectual, the kind of thought you're thinking when you're being connected to reality tangibly, and you're not ignoring your feelings and you're not ignoring what's going on around you. You can't define Begriff without it starting to raise questions about the stupidities inherent in Verstand. That the half-wittedness of Verstand begins to come into focus as you define Begriff as being the opposite of Verstand. And so you can see why an intellectual gets uncomfortable with that and wants to say, no, those are not thoughts, and that's not thinking, and that's irrational. It's not a thing. It's an unthing. It's irrationality. It's unthinking. Only I think. Only when I do my Verstand thing am I thinking. When your stuff is no, la, I can't hear you. That's not real. And this is how they trap themselves, and how I trapped myself in my 20s. That's how the trap works. So this idea of the mythic mind, the adult mind, this is the idea of a mind that recognizes that it takes Begriff and Verstand harnessed together into a kind of thinking that Hegel calls Vernunft. Before you start to deal with reality, not exactly as it is, because it's infinite and we're finite and there's always going to be problems, but let's say at least giving yourself a fighting chance to interact with reality, right? So whichever part of reality you're ignoring, because you're focusing too much on one faculty and not the other, if you got Vernunft, then the other faculty is there whacking you on the head saying, no, you're forgetting this other part. Don't forget to abstract and systematize if you're being too experiential. And if you go the other way and you get too abstract and systematized, then your experiential mind whacks you on the head and says, no, 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 don't go too far that way either. And it's not a balancing act because it's not a fragile thing that can easily be tipped, but it's a dynamic system in which each one pulls the other one back to make sure that you don't lose that ability to look at the world with binocular mental vision. This is the mythic mind in the definition Kenneth Smith is using. And that Hegel didn't use those words, but that's what he means by Vernunft. That's what he means by the absolute mind. That's the name of his chapter where he talks about Vernunft in the philosophy of Geist. And that's what Heraclitus and Aristotle are talking about when they talk about sophrosune, which is where you have an integrated mind that's able to deal with things in a holistic way. So with that as the setup, we've gone almost an hour and a half. We're almost halfway through today's course. We are now ready to begin the text. So, but it was a useful, revisit of a number of issues. And I hope that it helped Ella get ready for kind of where we're going to go next. So now we're actually in the text. We're in section F. I shared the link above to chapter 4 that David has put online for us. And if you scroll down into section F, Mythos and Logos, there's a number of paragraphs, and one of them has the 2 sections of text I shared up above in the chat. It's the paragraph beginning like a prehensile organ. We've been going through this paragraph for more than a month. And we've been doing it because my argument is that this paragraph is one of the densest things Kenneth Smith's ever written. Not in a bad way, but in the sense of there is an enormous amount of insight hidden in here in ways that are easy to overlook. And if we tease them out and untangle them, it will demystify for us what he means by mythos and what he means by logos, which is what this whole section F is supposed to do. It's supposed to get us to the point where we can put on and take off the ancient worldview and start to think about mythos and logos the way that the ancients did. So this is where it all comes together, and I'm hitting it from different angles. Today, the angle I'm taking is based on this phrase right here. You'll see it in the towards the end of the first chunk of that paragraph there. The mythic mind was prepared for seeing the order of its world and its own self. This is what we're talking about here, and this is an example of a phrase that before you understand what the ancients and what Kenneth mean by mythos, it sounds like gibberish or emotional, anachronism. Why are you, the lying mind can't possibly prepare you to see anything. So this is a non-sentence, it's not a thing. But if we understand the mythic mind not as a lying mind, which would be the modern interpretation, but as a whole mind that's able to bring together gnosis and noesis, that is to say, Verstand and Begriff strung together to create Vernunft, so that we're able to think thoughts that try to use reality to correct our models of reality. And we try to use our models of reality to affect the way that we look at the tangible reality. So both of them are trying to interpenetrate and give us a perspective. Then we can understand that he's basically saying the mature adult mind is prepared for seeing the order of its world and its own self. And that's the part that I want to explicate for us today. Why would that be true? What are we talking about here exactly? So as an example of mythos and logos, I've been playing lately with the idea of Star Trek and the 3 people who argue, who are the top officers of the Enterprise. We've got McCoy, we've got Spock, and we've got Kirk. And when we refer here not to the caricature of Kirk from the badly written episodes and from decades of people doing Kirk imitations, but to Kirk as he was originally written. So this is somebody who is trying to listen to all of his chief advisors and take all their perspectives into account and use them to fill in the gaps in the other advisors' perspectives. So McCoy is frequently expressed, despite the fact that he's a scientist, he wears the science color blue and he's got the insignia of medical and he is incredibly educated, but nevertheless, he is an emotionalist, as Spock accuses him of on more than one occasion. He is a subjectivist. He's very interested in what he thinks is, a charming, polite way to behave, in how things make people feel. Are they being candid about their emotions in a situation? How often does he accuse Spock of being a cold-blooded, heartless person? He's like, he doesn't have any truck with Verstand or with kind of the Banausic mind. He wants to see your connection to your feelings, and he wants to talk about how things make him feel. And he gives, as a result, although well-informed, he gives very subjective, emotionally and value-laden advice to Kirk. Spock, by contrast, is giving this as close as he can come to pure logic. He frequently, even when he's caught being emotional because he's half human, he will often deny it later. Like at the culmination of the episode about the Galileo 7, when he realizes they're not going to be seen, they're not going to escape the planet in the shuttlecraft, it's going to crash back to the planet. They only have a few hours, and he panics sort of and pushes the button that causes them to burn all their fuel so that it lights up like a flare in space. And at this point, he has no reason to think it's going to work, but it's sort of an emotional response. But when he's called on it on the bridge later on, he says, oh, no, I arrived at it purely by logic. It's a completely logical thing to do because I concluded that the other strategy wasn't going to work, and it had a 0% chance of work. And so, while this had a close to 0% chance of working, it wasn't exactly zero. So this was the logical thing to do, except that's a rationalization. And we all know it, right? That's not why he did it. He did it because he had a moment of emotion. But in general, he tries not to. He is trying to be the intellectual. He's trying to do logic and Verstand. He's trying to be purely noetic. And the result is that Kirk can't always listen to either one of them. To be in command, to be autonomous, to be heuristic, is to draw on both faculties, the experiential subjective faculty and the abstracting objective faculty, right? So it's not a coincidence that Hegel names the three sections of the philosophy of Geist: the subjective mind, the objective mind, and the absolute mind. Kirk is supposed to represent the absolute mind. Although later he's presented as a womanizer and, just shooting from the hip charisma guy. That was never the original Kirk. The original Kirk in Where No Man Has Gone Before, in school, he was a bookworm. He gets mocked for, lovingly mocked for how he used to walk around with a great big pile of books. He wanted to know everything. He wanted to learn everything. He's a smart guy. And what makes him fit for command is that he doesn't fall on either side of this divide between the faculties. And in fact, he surrounds himself with people who raise those faculties to their greatest extent, so that he can get everything you can get from the experiential side and everything you can get from the logical side. So he's fully armed to make his decisions. That's supposed to be the nature of the triumvirate. And in this, we see the mythic mind and its relationship to its earlier two stages of development. This is a very, I don't know who came up with this exactly, in the various people who were writing Star Trek and creating these characters, but there is a very Hegelian take on the human mind and the structure. So here's the thing. Think about the difficulties that we have explaining abstractly what Hegel's up to in the philosophy of Geist, or explaining the mythic mind. We've been at this for months. The rational mind, the intellectual mind versus the irrational mind, that is to say, the experiential mind, and how the mythic mind is supposed to pull them together into a whole that's armed with both perspectives. It's been very hard to explain this. But a generation of people grew up predisposed to understand it, or at least recognize it, because they saw it in Star Trek on the bridge. And if I'd started out this discussion 3 months ago or 2 years ago by saying, let's talk about McCoy and Spock and Kirk, it would have been much easier to set up this discussion and to reveal, what the three-part schema of Hegel's philosophy of Geist really is, right? And the reason that, and this is the part that matters, this is where we come back to the Kenneth Smith sentence. What is it that makes it easy? It's the bickering of McCoy and Spock. It's their loving insults of each other that make it go. If all we had was Spock or all we had was McCoy, it wouldn't work. It is the struggle between them where the emotional charge lies in all those scenes in Star Trek, right? Whenever the three of them are on the bridge and the two are bickering and Kirk's smiling, watching them go at it, this is the mythic mind's relationship to its two earlier stages of development. You're not, unlike when we develop into an intellectual, the goal is not to suppress one or the other half. The goal is to let them both talk. You want to hear from them. You're not replacing them with some better thing. The mythic mind is not, it's not an object that takes up the space that used to be taken up by the previous stages of development. It's not that you have to remove the others and put it in there. That would be the mechanistic way of thinking about this. It is a new dynamic system created by listening to both parts and weaving them together into a whole. It's not separate from them. It's comprised of them, but comprised of them in a specific relationship that allows each of them to do what it does best while having the things that it does worst be corrected by the other part of the mind. So that you don't have to turn down the benefits in order to turn down the drawbacks. I don't know if this is quite following. Normally, we think about if something has good parts and bad parts, if we can't tolerate a certain amount of bad, we turn it down, and then that turns down the good along with the bad. The volume on both drops. But the trick of polyntropy, of a dynamic bound system like this, is that you can turn them all the way up, both of them all the way up, and they'll correct each other. So you get all the benefits of both. You don't get some sort of insipid gray compromise between the two. And you don't get some fragile balance that at any moment will fall apart. You get a very strong thing in which both of them is able, you're firing on both thrusters. They're both able to really go. This is the mythic mind. And this is what makes it absolutely different from either of the previous two stages. The previous two stages exclude each other. But the third stage incorporates both of them into a new whole that neither of the other was capable of doing on its own. That's half of what's meant by this phrase about seeing the order of the world in its own self. This is the part about seeing the order of your own self. Coming to understand that the great power of the adult mind does not lie in a faculty, but in a specific relationship between two faculties. That's the important part. That's what makes the adult mind go. Not an either or choice according to the law of the excluded middle. It's either one or the other, one's true and one's false. It's not that at all. They have to be strung together into an operational bow or lyre. Phil, go ahead. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'm going to say kind of like what you said, except differently, because I'm an artist. And when you're talking about that, I immediately think of like when I do a work of art, there's always a relationship between the figure and the ground, right? I mean, the ground is context, the stuff that's in some sense, quote, not in focus, and the object is the thing that you're dealing with. There's always a relationship. But on the other hand, I mean, then you think, well, okay, if you pay too much attention to the ground, then in a sense, the picture shifts. And I think the human mind has the ability to look at a painting and look at the tree and look at the other tree and look at the cow and in the pasture, and you can zoom back and forth. Okay, that's a relationship. Now you're getting something about how things work together in some sense. But then I think you bring another dimension into it, which is the frame of reference. How do I, as a photographer or as a painter, how should I frame that? Because that'll give the context and the limitation. And I think that's something that you, as an individual, brings into the thing, see the relationship between the two. I remember a photographer tells me, like, why do you do photography at all? And this particular guy says, I do it because it's only when I do it that I actually see what the thing is. Because otherwise it just sort of exists. And so the abstraction in some way, in a sense, puts a frame. But then, of course, I go to my other thing, like, yeah, as I said about criticizing this artist who came and, you know, had a problem with one quarter of her drawing, painting, or whatever, and she didn't know how to fix it, you know, because she's stuck in the frame of reference. I said, well, why don't you just add a piece of paper and just draw outside of the frame, right? I mean, so therefore you have to understand that even the frame of reference itself is equivocal, which means that you have to expand your frame of reference, which, by the way, gets back to what Sharon said about experiencing others, you know, like maybe painting doesn't express what you need to do. Maybe you have to do it in a musical composition, you know, maybe it actually should be a scientific experiment. All these things, unfortunately, we're all locked into our particular professions. But this is what I think, like I said, instead of like just sort of seeing, like, how far could I go back to the painting to see that the distant thing that's in the background? Maybe what I need to do is broaden the horizon, you know, go back and zoom, you know, and zoom out, you know, and see more in some sense. So I think that on that level, once you begin to see the frame of reference, particularly see the frame of reference could be expanded.
Bananas? I do not. I hope you borrow photo.
Either expanded or narrow, then it gives you a degree of into the relationship of the thing you're dealing with. Okay, and I think that's kind of important because, you know, because I think you as an individual also have to enter into the world. So it also leaves you to think, like, God, you know, maybe philosophy is not the deepest of the human activities. Maybe the arts are in some way. So that's funny. Okay, that's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, you know, there's an argument to be made that religion arose from the practice of art, and that, you know, certainly the Greeks thought that philosophy arose from the practice of religion. You know, there is an element to which the cosmos will amaze us and force us out of the traps of our minds if we give it a chance. And that dilation of the Geist, as Hegel says, is really at the heart of both what the artist hopes to achieve, you know, to really blow your socks off and give you an insight, and also what the philosopher is trying to do. So yeah. All right. So let's build on this. What we see here is this idea that you can find within yourself, if you're lucky, you can find this dynamic in which you've got different faculties that are each only giving you part of the information. And you can see there's this opportunity to learn that there isn't one right perspective. This is the hard thing. For somebody trapped within either of the two half-witted stages of development, this is what's really hard to understand, that neither of them is right and neither of them is wrong. Both of them are partially right and partially wrong. But the perspectives, and this for Ella's benefit, this goes back to one of the earlier lettered sections in chapter 4. The Greeks didn't use a mechanical parts, things-oriented way of looking at the world and themselves. They used an organism, a living thing metaphor for everything. So they would apply that to the mind as well, or even to a perspective of the mind. So these two stages of developments that we're talking about, you know, after birth, the second stage, the stage after the first birth, the experiential stage, and then this abstracting, systematizing stage after the second birth. These are not tools to be picked up and put down. Now, Phil was talking earlier about the holding of the spear in the hunt and how the tool feels in the hands. And in martial arts, when you're studying Kobudo, you're studying the use of traditional Okinawan weapons. They talk about that part of your goal is to get to where you are so familiar with holding and manipulating the tool that it really does feel like part of your body, like an extension of your body. But of course, as Kenneth would argue, and drawing off of a long line of philosophers, when you pick up a hammer, it picks you up too, and you start to become the man with the hammer who sees every problem as being a nail. So you start to, the more tool-oriented you are, the more you begin to see yourself as a tool too, what Phil was talking about. It's a natural extension of the utilitarian perspective. And as part of that, it becomes natural to think that these faculties of the mind that we're talking about, or these stages of development, are also just tools, and that you should be able to use the tool to see certain things in reality and then put it down, and it doesn't control you. But what Hegel's arguing, and what Kenneth Smith is arguing, is that these are more like real tools that change your perspective, so that in a way they do control you. There are plenty of things in the world you should not try to solve with a hammer. But while you're holding the hammer, especially if you've been hitting a few things, the odds that you're going to try to solve those problems with a hammer inappropriately goes way up, because you're an extension of the hammer now. Things really do start to look like nails that aren't nails. You can't help it. And it's the same with, if you are in deep into the experiential mind and its perspective, you don't just use it, it uses you as its vehicle for interpreting the world. And it's going to guide you, it's going to make you tend to focus on the things that it rewards and notices, and tend to overlook the things that it doesn't focus on. That is, your whole perspective, your personality, and your modes of thought all begin to align around that center into what the Greeks would naturally say becomes an organism, a whole. You and the faculty become a whole together. It's not just a tool you pick up and put down. Same is true if you escape that into the overly intellectualized, Verstand mind, the Banausic mind, then your thoughts, and we may, to a Banausos, it's natural to say the body is a machine and the brain is a computer. Everything starts to look like things when you get too intellectualized. But the Greeks would say, oh no, even when you're using this most mechanistic, utilitarian-oriented of faculties, it still remains an organism, and it wants to be a whole. It wants to focus you on the things that make sense to it, and to have you look away from the things that it doesn't have a place for. And so your entire interpretation of yourself and the world changes until it seems like it's a logical, rational world, and you're a logical, rational entity, and that's all there is. So both of these become ways of interpreting the world and yourself that invest in a single perspective as being complete and true and enough, and that you don't need any others. And in fact, others wouldn't even make sense. This is the only perspective that makes sense. And for almost all moderns, almost all the time, we are immersed in that deeper delusion that there is one right answer, that there is one right perspective, and all we have to do is find it. Even when we're trying to be ecumenical, we say there's still only one right answer. It's just that everybody has a piece of it. So we need to collect from everybody to put together the one right answer. We still think there's a right perspective. But the breakthrough here, and this is why he's talking about the world and the self, the world and the mind. He puts them both together in the same. For those of you who've been with me when I was talking about Heraclitus, this is the same construction that Heraclitus does when he talks about the nature around the nature around us and within us. There's two infinities, and it's the relationship between the two where the charge is. That's what Kenneth Smith is doing here. He's saying the order of the self, of the mind, and the order of the world are related to each other. And that relationship is where all the important parts are to being a human being. This is where the real charge comes in coming to understand that it's not possible for any single human perspective to be the right one, ever. And to an ancient, this was obvious. It was obvious because they understand that we're finite. and they understand that the cosmos is infinite. And you can't fit an infinite thing into a finite space without doing violence to it. This is why the myth of Procrustes, right? Trying to fit guests on the bed, he either stretches them or cuts parts off until they fit, until they're right. And that this is what happens when you think that one finite perspective can possibly encompass an infinite cosmos. It means you're going to do horrific, you're going to mutilate the world to fit it on the finite bed of your mind, as long as you believe there is one right perspective. That's what happens when you try to cram the infinite into the finite. And so the solution to this, to the Greeks, the solution is, genothi seauton, know thyself, know that you're finite, know that your life is limited, know that your creative works are limited, and know that your understanding is limited. And if you know those things, then you can stop believing that it's possible to fit the entire cosmos into your head. You could stop trying to mutilate it to fit. And instead, you can start to understand that the secret to doing better in your relationship with the world is not to find the one true perspective, but to collect different perspectives that offer you different angles, right? So that sometimes you can look at it from one side, and then when that's not giving you enough, you can turn and go somewhere else and look at it from another angle and see things that the other perspective didn't show you. So even though you've only got a finite number of places in your mind to hold ideas, you can be swapping in and out which ideas you're attending to, which parts of reality you're attending to. You can move around where the focus is by learning not to overinvest in individual perspectives. This is a really sophisticated understanding of the relationship of the human mind to reality. We're going to get into it more in a moment. But part of why I want to underscore that is our understanding of reality isn't anywhere near this sophisticated. We think there is one right answer. It's called the truth. And moderns have more truth than anybody ever did before. And the more modernly we behave in time, the more truth we will have, until ostensibly we could have all the truth. The modern perspective defines itself exclusively as the right one, or the rightest one, or the one that is rightening into the right direction the most rightly of any perspective that ever existed. We automatically, as an ideology, militate against the idea that we have anything important to learn from medievals or ancients or anybody who came from before that. They're all just primitive, inferior versions of us. And it's right there in the name modern. So it's got to be sobering to look back and see that some of these primitives, ancient Greece, primitives, were able to understand in a more sophisticated way what the relationship is between human understanding and reality than we are as moderns. They could hold that nuanced perspective that there's no one right perspective, and that we need to collect perspectives and look at the cosmos from different angles. And this is the explanation. I know I saw Ellen's going to say something in a moment, but this is the explanation for why it is that moderns and medievals are constantly trying to exterminate other religions and other cultures and replace them with ourselves. Whereas the ancient Greek approach to religion was not to try to eliminate other religions, but to collect them, because other religions might have other understandings of the sacred that we might have missed, and we need to add to our collection of perspectives. That's why they were polytheists, is because they understood that it takes many perspectives to give a human being a chance to see reality closer to the way it really is. That is, their core worldview militated against genocide in a way that ours doesn't. Sharon, then Stephen, then Ella. Go ahead, Sharon. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
So I just have 3 sentences. Back to the text. Next paragraph, which I think kind of sums up or kind of explains what you're saying. It says, among the Greeks, philosophy indeed did not become an arid figment of the intellect, but retained the voice of a distinctive individual. Okay. And this revolution in which critical reason apparently deposed more flamboyant, elusive myths, displacing one kind of story, mythos, by another, logos, would never have been possible without the subliminal and intuitive preordination of Greek intelligence by myth. And this is where I think, for me, the focus is. But once a more stringent sense of logic and rationality consolidated itself, the Greek philosophers found themselves looking back across a chiasm of unthinkable transitions to the ways of archaic imaginations. So again, it's an evolutionary process.
Yes, developmental is what Hegel would say.
Yeah.
Developmental.
So this, I think, kind of summarizes it.
Yes. Yes. And right there is what Hegel talks about as the trap. That when you escape from an earlier stage of development into the new objective mind that he writes about, it becomes the previous way of looking at the world becomes inconceivable. It doesn't make sense anymore. You can't go back. You can't, as an adult, ever recapture that feeling you had when you were one day old, of the way that you interpreted the world when you were newborn. It's never going to come back. You can't reverse it. You've been born. You know, you went through the next birth, and you can't unbirth yourself any more than you can go back into the womb. So yeah, you're right, Sharon. This is him talking about this very issue. This is what he's wrestling with here. Thanks for bringing it up. Stephen, go ahead. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Might be of interest. This is something I've sort of learned, I think, over a long period of study about that sort of captain that they modelled Jim Kirk on. You know, you're going back to the Horatio Hornblowers, and a typical film, or was based on the book, was The Master and the Commander, where Russell Crowe plays this very idealised naval captain. There's only one problem. It's fiction. The Russell Crowe character, I assume you've seen the film, have you? The Master and Commander combines two elements which don't really occur in the same person. The British Navy was built on realists, on stern disciplinarians, because they had to keep order on those ships, even when it was literally going to the level of brutality, because the worst thing that could ever happen was a loss of discipline on one of those ships. But some of their great navigators, people like Cook or Bligh or Cochrane, I think his name was another commander, were the opposite of this. They were imaginative people which could achieve the impossible. But they could be disastrous. Bligh was this navigational genius who, in a rowboat, migrated across a third of the globe after the mutiny. On one level, he was a genius, but he was also a dreamer. He didn't have that strong grip on reality, and he didn't fully realise, he thought, I can be friends with my crew, let them play around how they like. He was a humanitarian, but not the stern disciplinarian. And that's why he lost. And, you know, Cook was another brilliant navigator, and people see him as this sort of stern figure, but he wasn't. He was actually another dreamer. But with the dreamer comes the artistic talent, the fine ability to navigate, to draw maps and so on. Cook can achieve what the others didn't. Bligh could achieve what the others didn't. Cochrane could go and take over a ship which was about 4 times as powerful as his own ship. In the Master and Commander is based on the real story. Unfortunately, it wasn't a French ship. It was an American ship that had been sent to raid the British in the War of 1812 had been sent to raid the British whaling ships in the South Pacific. And the commander was given an order to stop it. Unfortunately, the American ship had about twice the firepower of his own ship. But in the British Navy, those are the sort of orders were given. Luckily for him, the American ship ran aground and he was finally able to catch up with it and defeat it because it was stuck. Because wouldn't it have been wonderful in the movies if they had have made it the American ship that was in the novel, and we could have all cheered on as those glorious British guys were smacking the Americans around. Wouldn't that have been lovely? But this is the element.
Yeah.
In these heroic characters, these Hollywood script writers will combine all the most perfect qualities which don't tend to exist in the one person. The one person, he might be a dreamer, a great artist, be able to achieve things that way, and the other person's a stern realist.
Mm-hmm.
Don't tend to get the two together. We only see that in the movies. And it's so attractive.
Yes.
When we see somebody like Kirk,
yes,
who's such a montage of all the things that we'd want to be, but couldn't really occur in the one man at the same strength. But people don't understand this. They think it's real, that these personalities are real. They're creations. People don't understand this. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, this is modernity's fantasizing without realizing about what an Aristos might be like. And it's unrealistic in the modern era because we don't allow Aristoi to develop. They're too dangerous. They're liable to start changing things. We don't want things to change. You know, in the early stages of modernity, Aristoi had big roles to play in building the new world order out of the ruins of medievalism. But once we began to generate real wealth, the powers that be it became a problem to have these charismatic creative figures out there who are able to, you don't want a Joan of Arc popping up every other year and leading the entire countryside in a revolt against corruption when you're the corrupt one. You're sort of like, you know what? I think we need to abort that in the womb. We need to make sure that people can develop into one of the two easier to manipulate personality types. We're willing to tolerate Duloi and we're willing to tolerate Banausoi because they each come with a leash. But we're not willing to tolerate Aristoi, so we don't let them develop. The closest things to Aristoi that we see for the last 500 years are typically broken Aristoi, people who are either Duloi or Banausoi who have figured out that they're inadequate and that there should be that third form. They're reaching in that direction, but they can't get there because they have no cultural or social support to help cultivate them. It's like, if you want to learn to be a great traditional Okinawan martial artist, and you don't have a sensei and a dojo to cultivate you and help you do it, whatever it is that you're going to develop on your own based on watching movies, reading comic books, you can call it martial arts, but it's a joke, right? It's going to be some kind of horrible caricature of what the real thing would have been. And I say that as somebody who's studied traditional Okinawan martial arts all my life. I went a long time when I was a workaholic where I didn't have a dojo and I was just continuing based on what I remembered and exploring. And when I eventually did get a dojo and a sensei again, I discovered that although it was, good for my fitness that I had engaged in those activities without any guidance, I'd gone wrong in so many ways. So many things that seem to make sense don't actually work. And the only way you find out is by having somebody. It's like what Donald said. If you want to develop into becoming an Aristos, says Kenneth Smith, you need to find one and follow him around and see what he does. That's how it works in the traditional martial arts dojo. You're following around somebody who's got all the pieces firing, and gradually over time you can get better. But without that example, the living example of the person, all you can do is fantasize, and then you end up with a Kirk, like you're saying, Stephen. You end up with some fictional fantasy of what we imagine a whole-minded person would be like. I think Kenneth would argue we're not going to see another Aristos until our conditions change dramatically such that we can start cultivating them again. Because it takes, you need midwives to guide you through the third birth into the fourth mind. And without that, you just end up trapped along the way. Ella, I saw you came off of mute. Did you have something you wanted to add?
Yes, actually, I'm glad you brought up the social support. And it's sort of, I had actually, with a different phenomenon, wanted to bring that in as well. So I grew up in a small rural community originally. I'm in a large city now, and have been for over 50 years, but it was a whole different, I guess, pretty close to mythos type of environment, close to nature and, very in tune with nature, egalitarian, more or less, collective society, very rural, very small community, non-competitive. There were a lot of intrinsically valuable things in that society in terms of, being grounded, I think, with nature and being so important, but also socially having those connections, being of a deeper nature. But then, of course, went into advanced education and life in general. Decades later, I'm looking and applying this. I looked into the Begriff, Verstand, and Vernunft of Hegel, and I was just thinking that, mythos being, the mythic mind being more like the Vernunft, which is a combination of the Begriff and Verstand. And I actually think that I'm an embodiment of that in a sense, and I always have that embedded, that mythos embedded at some level. And, I don't know if that's just my cultural experience or if it's a part of everyone to some extent, and it's just hasn't had an opportunity to be brought out culturally or for others, and perhaps could be. And anyway, and my other point with the social support is with the mythos culture, it was a poor community. I'm wondering if it is in fact developmental, as you mentioned earlier, that it just seems like going into the social, Hegel, then Marx, in order to bring out the Verstand, so that you have more of a complexity, more of a, the intellectual side, the Verstand and the Begriff. Wouldn't you, by necessity, need the institutions, the cultural means, the economic means to develop that side, the Verstand, to enhance the Begriff as well? It's sort of the opposite of what you were talking about, but
Yeah. I mean, these stages are, we can't skip one on the way to the others. They're essential. And, this idea of Vernunft as not replacing gnosis and not replacing noesis, but practicing both of them and strengthening them to the point that you can harness them together and use them to correct each other. This is the Greeks and everybody along this tradition of existentialist philosophy has tried to talk about this, has used different language to say it, but the basic idea is that you got to develop both sides, and you've got to have help figuring out how to combine them into a coherent whole. The way I like to think about it is, we can imagine that there aren't any Aristoi and haven't been for centuries, except maybe, to use a martial arts analogy, sort of at the white belt level. We've got people who figured out there needs to be a mix, that there needs to be a blending, a dynamic system, and that they try and they do their best. But we don't get to see what, you know, a full Aristos on fire would look like, because there's no place for them in our society. They would almost immediately get into trouble and end up either in prison or homeless or a mental hospital or dead. So, you know, our white belt Aristoi who have sort of just risen to the level of cluing in that this is something that they need to do and want to do, you know, they find niches in society where they can survive acting like a Benausos or a Doulos, you know, finding Begriff or Verstand professions. And then they try to satisfy the missing half of themselves on their time off, on weekends and nights, and trying to, you know, be a more whole-minded person, but in a way that they can't at work usually. It's very rare to find professions that haven't been stripped down to just one or the other in the modern order. And that's how we do it, right? That's how modernity keeps people in check. That's how we keep full-fledged Aristoi from developing, is we say, you have no right to exist, so you have to earn a living. If you don't keep earning that living and keep paying rent on life, then you're going to be thrown out. You'll be on the streets, you'll be homeless. So it kind of creates this relentless drive to keep focusing on conforming in whichever of the two flavors is allowed during the day, at least during 8 hours, so that you don't end up with the intolerable, unacceptable alternative, which is, you know, homelessness. I've got homeless people in my family because their drive to become Aristoi was too strong. They couldn't learn how to work in an office or anywhere else, and they're basically unemployable. They're, you know, poor. I have a brother who's been homeless for years, and this is what happens to people who can't learn to imitate the Dulic or Benausic lifestyle enough to earn the money required to pay the bills. It's the structure of modernity. So I think, you know, they would agree with you. Say Hegel certainly is agreeing with you about the idea that there is a drive in us to complete our development. Just like there's a biological physical drive to grow up physically, just like there is the embryogenesis, the whole process of development in the womb, there's a drive for that in us. Hegel argues it's the same with our mind / spirit, our Geist, that there is a drive to move in the direction of becoming Aristoi. Whether everybody would do it eventually or not, I don't think anybody knows. The Greeks certainly didn't know. Kenneth Smith doesn't know. Says, you know, why do people sort out the way that they do? Are they people who would have become Aristoi under other circumstances that were denied to them, or is this just nature producing diversity? We don't know.
Yeah, I just a quick comment. I'm suggesting that we could allow those who would become Aristoi, given the opportunity, if they had the economic opportunity. I mean, you're right. There will be some that may not, but I'm talking about the economic and social opportunity that isn't available. It's
right.
Sort of a class thing. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm with you, Ella. This is certainly Kenneth Smith's argument that to get a better human world, we need to change things so that Aristoi can develop, because Aristoi play a critical role within the human species in terms of our survival. So, all right, Phil, and then we'll go back to the text for the remaining hour.
Yeah, I agree with you that we all want to develop, but I have a slightly different perspective. Because, you know, like, I think that at least part of the development should be left to me. I could understand why it's good to learn knowledge from others, and I do that. But I always like, whether I read a book or go to a lecture, to absorb the knowledge. I always like that there's something left over for me to mull over and add to it or change it in some way. That's a creative part. And to me, when it's just handed to me, it's totally complete. Even if I know it's totally complete, I find it a little bit disturbing, as if there's nothing left. Like that's all there is. All you do is copy, 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 as if Betty Crocker had left a template that there's nothing left. And all I have to do is like stamp out endless Betty Crockers, and there you got these lovely meals. First of all, I just don't think that's true, number one. Okay. And number two, even if it was true, it would just be so boring. I couldn't stand it. So to me, like in some way, if I don't interact with it and add something to it, if not for society, at least to myself, then it is incomplete on its own, because I'm interested in my own development more than anything else, because that's my duty to, in a sense, grow and become whoever I am, or whoever I will be, as best I could. And it just seems to me learning even from the master, if there was one, is not complete. I experienced this when I was in art. I mean, when I was an art student, I was going along fine. I was incorporating this and that. I almost embody, well, I shouldn't say the history of art, but a lot of the history of art, but certainly embody a lot of the history of modern art. And one day what happened was I painted this painting. It was disturbing to me because it seemed really ugly. Like I couldn't figure out why it was, and yet I did it. And I actually, it became a crisis. And I literally walked out of painting for a year, and then went into sculpture and do other things. And I went through another thing where I refuted that. And looking back, I realized that I have learned all I could, and now it's time to venture on my own, right? And like I said, it was a deep crisis. Like I said, my teacher was beginning to say, like, Phil, I had a snoot full of your negativity, right? And they didn't realize that I was not so much rejecting history, but I was rejecting that there's no land left for me to explore. And luckily, and that allowed me to, in a sense, finally become myself, rather than, how should I say, incorporation of all that there was, and that's all there was. And I think that aspect is important. And I think that aspect is something that, because and I can understand why it's good to have Betty Crocker. I mean, in one sense, it's good to have maps. It's good to have this and that, because it just makes life so much easier, In fact, it's even better to have a TV dinner because you can just throw it in the microwave and there you are. And it's like, okay, yeah, it does make it easier, but what it robs from you is your own creativity, your own desire to be yourself, whoever that is. And yourself is never an exact copy of somebody else, or even a sum of somebody else's, but it's congealing them and then going beyond that. And I think if you don't add your factor into it, somehow you have not fulfilled your full potential. You have just became a clone, something else. I think that's what a modern society robs from people.
Yes.
And there's a deep desire to, in a sense, become yourself in some sense. And I think the arts kind of allows you to do that, because science has become so complex that it's hard to enter that world. First of all, you can't enter as a singular anymore. You have to be in a committee to do so, right? The arts, you're still able to fly like Charles Lindbergh, the lone eagle. And so I guess I have a commitment on the one hand to society, but also a commitment to be myself.
Yeah.
So that's important. So that's why I leave it. And what I think is, I reflect back to this, in the Old Testament, in the beginning, God created the world. God was a creative guy. In the New Testament, in the beginning was Logos, and the Logos was God. Now, the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. Look at how we have, well, created a template for God.
Mhm.
That is so much easier to get to God now that we have the template. Just follow the map, and there you are. You arrived at God. God, it's just so much easier than have to claw your way from the finite world to try to get to where God would be. And that's, and we're not, I guess, some of us, part of us, I shouldn't say some of us, meaning leaving me out. There's a part in which we like the easy road. And that's not what existence is about. You know, that's it. That's it, Phil.
Appreciate it. Go ahead,
Can
Sharon,
I just say something
please.
just to add to what Phil is saying? And this is reading ahead. And when he was talking, it came across my thought. He says, for the Greeks realize that human personality and intelligence cannot be taken for granted as being all of the same quality and tendency. At the core of every individual self is a heterogeneous character, the logic of its own potential and energies, which may not even be coherent with itself, much less structurally congruent with other personalities. So know thyself is entirely individual and definitely up to you. And the Greeks recognize it. And in this next section, which is section G, where they talk about character and class.
Yeah.
And those two sentences just came from that. Really delve into that, and which is where we are now.
They do, yeah.
It's a highly individual exercise. And I think it goes both ways for arts or science. And the way I see personalities, you have to have certain tenets in which to function, and you function with those tenets, whether you're an artist, whether you're a scientist, whether you're an engineer. And we won't get into them now. But as I said, it's developmental and it's part of a process.
Right. I'm with you, Sharon. Yeah, this is all over Christopher Alexander's philosophy of architecture when he talks about the stamping out copies of things being a huge problem with modernity, and that, you know, really every single house needs to be different. And the reason it needs to be different is it's in a different place. There's different sunlight, there's different views, there's different, you know, everything is different about where everything is. And so, you know, if you put all the windows exactly the same number of feet in from the corner of the house, some of them will get beautiful views and others are going to be looking at garbage cans, and that doesn't work. You got to move the windows to where they show you the thing that's best about that location for that house. There's a, you know, and in this, he's trying to make architecture mimic what living systems do, which is that they each follow their own course of development. I can't remember. It was Joseph a couple of weeks ago who was talking about history as this tug of war between agency and contingency, saying on the one hand, you go into it with your character and your principles at work, but on the other hand, the way that they actually express themselves depends upon what you run into. And as a result, you know, every tree is a tree, but at the same time, every single tree is different from every other tree. You know, it's what happens in the process of maturation, is this individuation. So I'm right there with you. Thanks for bringing that up. Ella and then Donald. Go ahead, Ella. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Sure, just to follow up. Yes, in the with the idea of individualism, I think, especially in the Western world, it's you know, it's overrated to some extent, and it could just be a cultural thing. And perhaps if you were from a collective culture, you would view it very differently. But having been from more of a collective culture in a rural environment, going to a highly urban culture in a competitive environment, I honestly see that there is a lot of yin and yang, positive and negative in both. And I'm just looking for a way, economically and socially, as Hegel would depart from Kant on this, Hegel would, and to a greater extent Marx, would say, hey, you have the opportunity, if you're a poor child, you can go to university and not be totally stuck in a more begriff state of mind, but you have the opportunity to develop intellectually and proceed forth. I think that is developing individualism, those innate qualities. And I think it's important to realize that some people don't have that opportunity, and to develop individualistic. I mean, they will to the extent that they can within a given environment. People are very much individuals. We agree on that. But in any environment, poor, rich, whatever the culture, they're individuals. But to provide opportunities so that those who aren't born into, a class where they can have and develop that agency and contingence, that in large part very much depends on your education. If you have a high school diploma, you're not going to be able to have much agency and contingency in today's world in the United States. So I'm not saying people don't have agency and contingency. I'm just saying that some people have more and don't realize they have more because of, the class they were born into. And not to say that anyone is responsible for that. You don't choose that. But to, in a sense, just develop that extra perspective that many people don't. Thank you.
Thank you, Ella. Yeah, I think if I remember right, and I'm flying off the cuff here, I think it was Stephen Jay Gould, evolutionary biologist, who said he was a lot less curious about the volume of Einstein's brain than he was about the certainty that people much, much smarter than Einstein were out picking fruit in the fields, and we would never get to find out what they could have given to humanity because they never got the opportunity to fully self-actualize. These issues of capacity and opportunity, we talked about them a few months ago a little bit when we were talking about I think it was section E, where we were talking about character and the way that the Greeks believed the purpose of education is not to ensure that everybody can pass the same standardized test. It's to give students so many opportunities to try different things that whatever it is that people's gifts are that could develop into something wonderful, it improves the chances that they're going to find that thing. That if you've got a Beethoven hiding somewhere amongst you, he's going to get a chance to sit down at the piano and go, whoa, hey, this is neat, and try developing that thing. Because what you want out of people is what are these individual capacities for developments that could benefit them and the whole culture if only they discovered them and had the opportunity to bring them to fruition. So it's interesting to contrast that Greek approach, the ancient Greek approach to education, paideia and anthropoculture, against the modernist obsession with standardized tests and whether everybody's identical or not. Sharon, I saw you drop off mute for a sec. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, because I want to steal 60 seconds of Donald's time, because I think, and to follow up on what Ella says, because I feel very strongly about this. I feel that individualism is one of the myths of our culture, right? And I also think that individualism and community interact with each other. They play off each other to enhance the development of the self, of the individual. And opportunity comes into this. You may not be given the opportunity, but some people with no opportunity still strive because of the drive for that self. And if they can find the right notch in the community, some struggle more than others, then self-development is enhanced or achieved. But I think individualism per se, as a sole entity, is one of the myths of our culture.
Yes, using
Thank
myth,
you, Donald.
using myth in the modern definition. Yes, that's right. That's right.
Yes.
Thanks, Sharon. Go ahead, Donald. What's on your mind?
Oh, I just wanted to talk to Sharon. So I don't mind her taking time, but because I think she got to the point I wanted to add to what she said earlier is that, yeah, Gnothe se auton, know thyself. It's where we begin, not where we end. But one of the things, it's true that what we end up knowing is ourself, but that's also our gateway into knowing others. We see their behavior. We don't see their internality. And our intuitions about that come from our own knowledge of our own selves. First, just that they have an internality, because we do. We're self-conscious. Hey, maybe these other creatures are too. And we can talk to them, which is talking is, Kenneth once told me that talking is the next best thing to mind reading, or it's very close, very close. And so the other thing is that if I understand the Republic at all, if we had aristic leaders, they wouldn't be homeless, but they would still be without possessions and without family. So they don't get very far up, even being the leaders of a polis. You're still, in order to do that well, you have to make sacrifices that maybe even, maybe none among us today would be willing to do. You would get to live you would get a house, but it wouldn't be yours. And you could have no possessions by law, nor children, in order to avoid the things that, in Greek, being an idiot. How do you free someone from the personal, the individual, so that they can rule the polis? Well, you don't allow them to have personal things, at least in Plato's little story that he told. I do think we do have myths today. Maybe individualism is not a myth just in the false modern sense. It's maybe is held by the culture to be a true myth, a myth. They're true. Greeks talked about false myths. They didn't talk about true myths. They talked about pseudos-mythos, not. So, but what we do, our science has myths. There's no physics about the beginning. There's a story. What the end is like, there's a story. It's better than the one about the beginning, because heat death has more, math behind it, I guess, in modern physics terms. How everything will achieve the same temperature, whereas the math doesn't work at the beginning. There's nothing there. You go back and it goes away. And I wanted to say to Ella, welcome for being here. And Whitehead is certainly kind of relevant. Not that my Whitehead is 50 years old, and sadly, but I did read a few books by him, and only one thing stood out where he talked about the myth of misplaced concreteness, which I think is directly from Hegel. In abstraction, we begin to err. And that's exactly what Whitehead was trying to bring up, that our science thinks of its formulas as being more real than the phenomena they apply to. Well, goodbye.
Hey, Stephen, it's your turn.
Oh, sorry. I've been on mute. I was gonna say, in response to Donald, one thing about, you can read Plato's Republic, and I think this is the way we usually read it, as this is what he thinks would be best. But I think there's a great deal of enjoyment to be had if instead you read it as, what has he had enough of in the corruption of Greek society, and he's not putting up with it any longer, right? Every time he says, the people in charge should have nothing. They should have no possessions at all. So they finally focus on doing the right thing. You can hear the rest of the argument, which is, oh my God, that goddamn Athenians who are constantly claiming to be aristoi, but then when they get in charge, they're just lining their own pockets and making their families rich. And I wish they would focus on governing for a change, right? There's culture criticism hiding under each one of Plato's prescriptions. Again, that sort of goes hand in hand with this transition.
If not, in my view, a pretty good example about why it's the same thing. It's repeated. Why won't the philosopher go back down in the cave?
Yes.
Why won't the philosopher agree to rule the polis? Well, you're never going to get anybody, even a philosopher, to accept conditions like this.
Uh-huh.
And if they're shown to be necessary for good rule, well, no chance. You're
That's
right.
Way of saying it's not going to work.
It's not going to work. Can't work.
Yeah. Anyway, thanks, Donald. Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, when you've brought up the issue of homeless people, thing was, I grew up in an era when things were different. Now, I was just looking at the stats for the United States in 1950. Something like 4 people out of 1,000 were in permanent mental care. And one of the things I came across as somebody was pointing out, of course, they closed down the mental institutions. I don't know why. Maybe they didn't want to spend the money. But what they're doing now with a lot of people who have fallen through the cracks of sanity is that they're putting them in prison with hardened criminals. The whole thing about mental institutions, where you had people who had problems that might break a few rules, but they weren't hardened criminals. But now they're putting them together. I just wonder that they made a huge error in closing down the mental institutions.
Yeah.
What was all behind it? Because it looks like this whole homeless situation of people, basically, they're not with it. I've met homeless people. Often they're not dumb. A lot of them are rather intellectual. There's certainly a lot of them are dreamers, or just somehow have lost the ability to get along with reality. And they need to be taken care of. But for some reason, they're not doing it anymore in the same way.
Right.
Was it money? Was it something else? I don't know. But I just think that they're making a big mistake somewhere about this whole situation, or that they just don't care. Thank you.
Yeah, it's something we talk about a lot in the United States, and I've got a lot of mentally ill people in my family, both currently and among my ancestors. And I have mental illness. I have a kind of bipolar. So we've spent a lot of time looking at this problem, and it's just clear during the Reagan era there was just there was a belief that government should only exist for the military and police and for no other function. And it was widely stated during the 80s, and there were massive cutbacks on everything that wasn't the military or police. Military and police, they put lots more money into, so the country ended up accumulating enormous debts during those years, although they seem small by comparison with what we do now. But at the time, the slashing of the mental institution budgets was justified by saying, it's just not worth it to spend all this money. It's just not worth it. And this is where, I don't know if in Australia this phrase came across the Pacific, but under the Bush administration, Bush's response to all the people falling through the cracks was, it's okay, we don't need government to do this because the people will automatically come together to solve all of society's problems on their own. Instead of worshiping government, you should trust in 1,000 points of light. That was the expression of the Bush era. 1,000 points of light of individual benefactors will come together and make our problems go away. And this really has the feel of the invisible hand of the marketplace as one of those, I think Kenneth Smith would say, desiderata, rather than anything there's any actual evidence for. Because what happened was, all our mentally ill people ended up on the streets and in prison, or dead. Those are the three places they ended up in. A fair number, not by any means the majority, but a sizable number of people executed by police officers on the streets were mentally ill people, and continue to be mentally ill people. And so that's our prescription. If you don't fit in, you can be homeless, or you can try to find a bed in a mental institution, or you can go to prison, or you can be dead. That's where you go. And of course, the way we define mentally ill is you don't make money for anybody. You can't hold down a job that generates income. And if you can't do that, then what use are you? It's sort of become, ever since the 1980s, the reigning political philosophy of the United States when it comes to this sort of thing. And built into it is the assumption that the way that the majority of people do things is sane. That committing ecocide is sane, playing games with nuclear weapons is sane, all of that the normal behavior we engage in, the sort of putting the entire species in danger, that's sane, is the unspoken premise of believing that anybody who's not sane is disposable. I think Kenneth Smith would argue that the Greek perspective on the modern era is that what we call sanity is a form of insanity. And so we really ought to have more compassion for people who are mentally ill, because there's something really seriously wrong with all of us. Anyway, Phil, then Sharon, then Donald. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I mean, like, there's an individual problem, and then there's a social problem. The one and the many, the one in society. And so a lot of that needs to be, and that's why, like, social political understanding is a very important one. Because, as Bush might have said, 1,000 points of light. I'm sure there are 1,000 points of light, but there might be 1,000,000 points of darkness that goes with it, right? And that's where the problem is. Like, I don't want to push that darkness all the way down to evil, but there's certainly a whole lot of selfishness in the world. And I think for that, you have to have a political system that will able to manage it, because individual by itself not manage it. Maybe a collective could manage it. Maybe if you had a big enough group, like, I guess, like, the workers now on strike, maybe they could manage a little bit of it. They can't really manage a whole lot of it. So to avoid those social political issues is, in a sense, you're left to your own devices, which is problematic. I myself never totally believe in the total virtue of people. I mean, I like to believe that, but I don't. So I feel like in some sense you're left at least a lot on your own, and you have to rely on yourself to a great degree, because I think because there are a million points of darkness, you know, which is what, you know, what's his name? His name, the Machiavelli, you know, is truly saying what society is really about, not the republic. The republic is what we wish it could be, or maybe not what it should be, but at least that way of thinking is what it should be, but it isn't. And we need to actually construct a government that deals with the million points of darkness as well as the 1,000 points of light, you know, because I think if you leave it to individuals, it's always comes short. I think that's why my whole devotion to the fallen angels is about. I do not have a whole lot of faith in humanity as it currently is constituted, right? But I still, but humanity does desire to have wings. Unfortunately, the fallen angels do not fly. They just have wings. They want to fly, they can't fly. And that's because of the million points of darkness that pulls us down with the gravity that we are stuck in. So as an individual, yes, you always have to be involved with the social political situation, but you always have to like put in a kind of reserve, like it may amount to nothing, and you better be ready to look out for yourself as well. That is kind of my warning. All right, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Sharon, tell us what's on your mind.
So in our discussion about mythos and logos, I came up with two things for myths. In this society, I think we have mythical concepts, you know, individualism, exceptionalism, all the things by which we live by. But then I went looking around for the mythic symbols that we have in our society. And I was pretty impressed with that. Like the NBC logo with the peacock is a mythic symbol. Starbucks has a mythic symbol. Versace with the head of Medusa is also another mythic symbol. And I found that very interesting. Nike, which is the victory, the Greek goddess of victory, swoosh, which symbolizes great power. That's another mythic symbol. So I thought, because I'm practical, that's just another way to relate to it. So we have the concept and the symbols. That's it.
Thank you, Sharon. Yeah, I think one of the places we see the distinction here between the modern and the ancient is the myth telling us something essential about the human condition that we need to know in order to survive as a species? So an example of a true myth in the ancient sense would be the belief that there existed these two races of one-eyed beings called Cyclopes. And it takes a while studying Greek myths before you figure out that the Cyclops is not just one group of people, it's two different groups of people. Because you've got the savage Cyclops like Polyphemus, who plays such a role in the Odyssey. You know, he enslaves and kills and eats a number of members of Odysseus's crew before Odysseus cleverly figures out how they can escape. And this guy is also the star of a satyr play that was written later on, what the Greeks call a comedy, which is a portrayal of sort of the despicable level of human existence rather than the noble level. And in the satyr play, Polyphemus basically talks about how he doesn't need to respect the gods because he can get everything he wants himself. He can, if Zeus gets angry and tries to throw thunderbolts, Polyphemus will just go into his cave, and so Zeus can't hit him. And he runs through a whole bunch of different gods and says how they're all powerless against him. And the only god he says is worth worshiping is my own stomach. And that's why I'm going to eat your crew, because as my sacrifice to the one god I truly worship. So here you see an experiential, bestial level Cyclops that's obsessed with his own appetites. But in the myths, there's another race of Cyclops that work for Hephaestus. And they're the ones that make all the amazing weapons and armor that the gods themselves wield, and that occasionally heroes like Perseus or someone else is allowed temporarily to borrow to use on their great quests. These incredible works of craftsmanship are being created by one-eyed beings called Cyclopes. And the question is, how could somebody like Polyphemus, who's basically a savage predator, how could he be indicative of a race of people that are making the finest, most technologically advanced works in existence, works worthy of the gods? And the answer is, well, there's two different races of Cyclopes. There's two different one-eyed perspectives on the world that see one thing but not the other. And in this, you're seeing an attempt by the Greeks to talk about the dualic perspective exemplified by Polyphemus, and the Banausic perspective exemplified by the servants of Hephaestus, that they're both half-witted monocular perspectives on the world, and that they each have their limitations. The servants of Hephaestus are great as servants of the divine, but you still wouldn't want them trying to run a society, because they still only have the one eye. That is, they're only using one of the faculties of their mind as the lord over themselves. You certainly wouldn't want Polyphemus trying to govern a society, because he wants to kill and eat you to satisfy his appetite. You're just a means to an end to his tummy for him. So this is their way of saying, along with Aristotle, that what you need are whole-minded people with a mythic mind that are capable of using both of the faculties and putting them to the use for the good of humanity. So this is an attempt through the use of monsters and kind of grotesque, memorable stories to convey really sophisticated things about the nature of the human mind and the stages of development and the nature of government. And it's all bound up inside that myth. The myth of Procrustes is another classic example. The guy who insists that things be stretched or amputated to fit his bed. This is an attempt to teach people about the limitations of the human mind and why they shouldn't assume that the thoughts they're thinking are perfect descriptions of reality, why they should assume that any mortal thinking about reality is in some ways warped or distorted. It's a caution to try to help us be wiser. So a myth in this sense goes far beyond sort of a logo or a reference to something out of mythology. It's an analogy. It's an attempt to explain something very complex in a very concise, memorable way that's sort of unforgettable. The labyrinth is a great myth. I mean, for trying to understand the ways in which somebody like Daedalus, who's so smart, so clever, top of his game, could nevertheless be so stupid as to build a trap that he couldn't get out of. And then to be surprised that the guy who ordered him to do it leaves him stuck in the middle. So he's trapped by his own cleverness. This is a myth, right? This is, in the ancient sense, this is a legitimate myth. It's a warning to every smart person until the end of time that you got to watch out about this, about your own cleverness becoming your own trap. So when it comes to Nike and all of these other logos, what we find is that the modernist usage of them strips them of all of their mythic quality and reduces them to nothing more than the equivalent of a name with a certain flavor. They're trying to be memorable, like the myths were trying to be memorable, but not in a way that will make you question Nike's labor practices or, Starbucks union practices. They don't want you actually engaging with the meat of mythology, which is about questioning the status quo and, learning how to be a wise and good person. They don't want you to do those things. They just want you to remember them and give them money. So it's this is what we mean about use value. They've sort of detected what they see to be the usefulness in these ancient myths and stripped out all the other parts, which is where the wisdom was. And what we're left with is like a shell of some kind. Go ahead, Sharon. I saw you came up.
There's significant discordance then.
Yes. And this is the language problem that Kenneth Smith keeps telling us about. It's hard to talk about myth, in the modern context because of what we do to it. Because of what
very interesting.
So thanks for bringing up those examples. They're really illuminating. Donald, go ahead, and then Phil.
I was just going to say, Reagan undoubtedly did a lot of things that people don't like, but there was another current, I think 20 years before Reagan, that said it's unjust to put people in psychiatric care facilities. This is just there's some normative idea about what having your mind, a sound mind, means that's invalid. That people are as we find them. And we don't get to judge who is crazy and who isn't. We may be the crazy ones, and we should have no power to lock them up. And this was quite a popular movement. And so we saw a confluence of people who were really willing to cut the funding and the people that really wanted them out of the hospitals anyway, because that was a great social injustice.
Right.
And, I think about things like that because for the Greeks, particularly Plato, Aristotle, they liked medicine because medicine was normative. Greek medicine had an idea of what the health of the body should be. And we've lost a lot of that willing to make those normative judgments. In modern, it's more, well, they're not doing any harm. Who knows who's crazy? I don't know. I can't judge it. I don't have the medical or the legal knowledge to know. But I heard, let's close those hospitals. I guess Reagan was willing to actually cut the funding, but there were many people that wanted the people out of the hospitals. I'm pretty sure they didn't want them on the street.
That's not what they thought would happen.
Maybe they were thinking about those 1,000 points of light, but I doubt that either. Yeah. Anyway, it's when a real agreement, a bipartisan agreement was that this is not what we do. And it may take years before it's ever revisited.
Thanks, Donald. Yeah,
I might add that years ago, you go back 200 years ago, they used to throw the insane in prison.
Yeah.
Until a guy came along and said, "Oh, we can do differently from this." Now they've gone back to the old way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Same old, huh? The eternal recurrence of the same. That was an earlier theme we discussed.
We did, didn't we? Well, and yes, I mean, what we're looking at here is simple-minded solutions to complex problems end up causing as many problems as they solve. So, you were talking about the movement to empty the abusive mental institutions. And we can go back to 1887 and Nellie Bly's great expose, where she got herself admitted to a mental hospital so she could do journalistic reporting on how horrific the circumstances were within those hospitals. And, you know, I was just reading the Kent Nerburn trilogy, the Native American trilogy, Neither Wolf Nor Dog, The Wolf at Twilight, and The Girl Who Sings to the Buffalo, where he's describing an expose he did on a mental health hospital that was used to round up Native Americans. Anybody who didn't fit in, anybody who wouldn't get a job, anybody who wouldn't speak English, they just accused them of being insane, and they'd send them off to this place in the middle of nowhere and basically torture them until they died. So, you know, there was good reason to want to see overhauls of mental hospitals, but the solution of let's just close them just took us back to an earlier problem we had before that. You know, and my mom was active in the 60s and early 70s in the halfway house movement. And they were also inspired by this sense that there were a lot of people going to jail for political reasons who didn't belong there. And that was true as far as it went, as John Dean later admitted. You know, the Nixon administration deliberately criminalized the activities of people that they thought might vote against Nixon so that they could get them out of the voting pool, you know, and win elections. But, you know, it turns out that those unfair political prisoners, they weren't the only people in prison. And if you release everybody from prison, you're also releasing rapists and murderers. And yeah. So we learned the hard way in our family about the dangers of sort of oversimplistic prescriptions for complicated problems. You know, this whole line of discussion is something I resonate with closely. Phil and then Ella, and then I think we're coming up on the end of the 3 hours. So go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, human beings seem to have a talent for making complex problem into complicated problems. So let's just put it that way. You know, instead of seeing the complexity, let's just convolute it even more and make it complicated because that'll solve it. Okay, maybe they believe in chaos theory. I don't know. Maybe there's a deep understanding there. I want to get back to logos though, because I have some knowledge of that. You know, I think that I'm going to approach it slightly differently from you, but essentially the same, is that symbols, which is actually that's tied to myth, actually, in a sense, has a deep relationship that is connected to the soul, if you believe in the soul. In other words, it's deeply embedded in us, that there's a deep understanding of that. Whereas logos are actually signs that pretend to be symbols, right? And signs are by itself has a little bit of the symbol look, but it's just appearance. And what it does, what a sign does, is like a word in which you need other words to create a story. That's what a sign is. Sign by itself has no meaning. Meaning exists in context to other words to produce a phrase, a sentence, a paragraph, and then you begin to get the story, which, by the way, is already above the subliminal line of this soul. And so what you do is you create something that looks good and seems to have a reference to something else. And my favorite thing is I always like to go to a restaurant, you know, and I ask like the waiter or waitress, like, I would like to have a Diet Pepsi. And of course they would always answer, we don't have Pepsi, would a Coca-Cola be okay? I tricked them into using the two most known words in the world, because most words are within a language, but Coca-Cola transcends a particular language. Coca-Cola is the second most known word in the world, at least it was 15 years ago. okay is the only word that's known more than Coca-Cola. That shows you what a branding of a sign could do, right?
Yeah.
Would Coca-Cola be okay? They don't even know that they spoke the most known. Of course, okay would be, everybody knows okay.
Right.
Maybe not everybody knows Coca-Cola. So that's how deeply embedded it is in the culture, but it's still a sign that a company is trying to induce upon you, hopefully to sink to a depth that it would become a symbol, but it is a sign. Whereas the symbol arises from underneath and comes up in a sense. So your soul is emerging through it and say, now I understand what it is. It was invisible before, but now it appears. Okay, that's it. My small lesson about what I know about graphic design.
Thanks, Bill. Okay, Ella, go ahead. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Just a great meetup. I love listening to everybody's insights and touching on a lot of topics that I think go back to explore the idea of mythology, and the concepts being presented here in the text. Yeah, I'm just looking at, I wanted to touch on the idea of the mentally ill and what happened with them, because it is so tragic. And just briefly, in my area in the Midwest, what they did was, I guess it was in the 70s, they only left, I think, one hospital open in a huge area of the state, and that was for the criminally insane. It's still operating, but for those who could get by on a lot of medication, they put them in group homes, is what they called them here. But then the funding about 10 years ago for these group homes, which were in a sense better than the institutions, in the sense that they were like a average home on a street. They had someone who was paid minimum wage and barely trained. That part of it I didn't think worked very well, coming in and watching over 4 to 5 residents in the home. And so it was more like a family. That was the idea, environment, with a caretaker. But the training was minimal. They were labeled and medicated heavily. Everybody would line up for their medication. There were no social opportunities to go anywhere, go bowling, go out to McDonald's or whatever. There were no opportunities for vocational development, because many of them could have worked at, minimal jobs in sheltered environments. So, and then this all actually has almost fallen apart. For the most part, it has, because the state actually put, there's huge drug addiction across the nation. I know in my area, it's really bad. So drug and alcohol department took the money of the mentally ill and rolled them all into one. And now they have to share the same funding. And it's just gone from, I don't know, because there's never been a good institute way to help the mentally ill. The institutions were really bad. The hell on earth. The group homes were a little bit better, but still they were institutions, but on a smaller level. And then you had I really don't know. I'm not in touch with, but there's never been a good answer to what to do. And now you hardly ever hear them talked about in the media. So they're not talked about. There are just certain social issues that are discussed all the time, and it's just not discussed as much as it should be, in my opinion. And and as far as who ends up in these situations, I could see where, Native Americans or anybody different in any way culturally would end up in that situation if they had some sort of different behavior, not necessarily aberrant, but different, or didn't quite fit in. But on the other hand, I do think class is a real huge factor, because you see so many people. I mean, in the United States, most people in poverty are Caucasian. And I don't know if a lot of people know that, but I mean, the overwhelming majority. I think there are 6% more people of color in poverty. And but if you go by head count, it's mostly Caucasian in America, because there are many more Caucasians. But there's some sort of myth out there that Caucasians aren't in poverty. And I don't know, because I guess it's because there's so many Caucasians that have there are a small amount of Caucasians that have a lot of wealth. And those are the ones you hear about. And the country is rich, rich, rich. But then again, it really isn't for about a third of the population. And a lot of the workers, with their jobs being shipped overseas and whatnot, and lost, and to make more global profits, they're now in poverty. So depending on what area of the country you're in, you would notice this. So, and back to the mentally ill problem, it often is related to trauma and class. I'm not saying there isn't a biological basis for it. Of course, there probably is, especially schizophrenia and other serious mental illnesses. And but it's also related to poverty, which reaches throughout the class system in America. And I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ella. And on that note, we've come to the end of our 3 hours, so we'll pick this up again next week. Before we break, for those of you who've been following along for the last few months, my wife's checkup last Monday was good. She's cancer-free. And so now she'll be in surveillance for the rest of her life, just keeping an eye on it to make sure it doesn't come back. But we're really excited about that. She's now allowed to eat blue cheese and other things that she was banned from eating for 5 months. So she's like, yes, yes, yes. So
can you give her a hug for me? Tell her Sharon sends her a hug.
I will. Thank you, Sharon. And,
I just want to respond to Ella, because I can't stop. I have to tell you that I have quite a bit of experience with the mentally ill, and it does fall more severely and more disproportionately on the lower socioeconomic level, regardless of race or class. I've lived with them for about 40 years, so this I know.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That's where the most trauma is, right? A lot of mental illness is the result of early trauma, and there's a lot more trauma in poverty.
And the incidence of mental illness may occur across the class spectrum, but the capacity to deal with it is more severe at the lower socioeconomic levels.
Yeah.
And therefore, it tends to be prolonged, and it tends to have outcomes that are poor.
Yeah. Yeah, that's my experience too. So thank you, everybody. And we'll see you in a week. We'll pick this up again.
And you tell Beverly that prayers work.
I will. I'll tell her.
All right. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
We see you next time, Ella.
Bye-bye.
Yes. So come back again, Ella. Come back.